Room 109 in the Shelby Center for Science and Technology was the epitome of academic safety. It was a Friday afternoon, February 12, 2010. 13 biologists sat around a U-shaped table, casually debating department budgets. The air was thick with the mundane drone of university bureaucracy. Then, the drone abruptly stopped. A Harvard-educated neurobiologist stood up from her chair. She offered no warnings. She simply raised a 9mm handgun and began methodically executing her colleagues. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Dr. Amy Bishop arrived in the Deep South carrying an invisible, heavy crown. When she accepted an assistant professor position at the University of Alabama in Huntsville in the fall of 2003, she didn't just bring her family and her research. She brought a resume that she wielded like a blunt instrument. A PhD in genetics from Harvard University. Years of prestigious postdoctoral work. To Bishop, these credentials were not merely academic achievements. They were indisputable proof of her intrinsic superiority. Huntsville is a recognized intellectual hub, heavily populated by aerospace engineers, defense contractors, and NASA scientists. Yet from the moment she stepped onto the UAH campus, Amy projected an air of absolute condescension. She was an academic from the elite Northeast. In her mind, she was slumming it. Raised in the middle-class suburb of Braintree, Massachusetts, her entire identity had been constructed around intellectual exceptionalism. Her family revered academic greatness, and Amy internalized this to a dangerous, obsessive degree. She didn't just want to participate in the scientific community, she demanded to dominate it. Her focus on neurobiology was intense, but her passion often seemed less about the pursuit of knowledge and more about the accolades that knowledge could bring. She craved the spotlight, the high-dollar grants, the publications in top-tier journals. She needed the world to recognize her as a generational genius. But the reality of Amy Bishop in the laboratory and the lecture hall was jarringly different from the genius she envisioned in her head. She was profoundly abrasive. Socially awkward to the point of overt hostility, she alienated her peers almost immediately. Interactions with her were described by colleagues as combative, disjointed, and exhausting. If someone questioned her methodologies, she didn't engage in standard academic debate. She registered it as a severe personal attack. She interrupted, she belittled, she demanded absolute deference. Graduate students found her erratic and her grading arbitrary. The entitlement radiating from her was suffocating. She operated under the rigid, unshakable belief that the university owed her endless resources and unquestioned respect simply because she possessed a Harvard degree. This desperate need for validation manifested in a frantic push to invent something revolutionary. Amy became consumed with developing an automated, portable cell incubator, a device she designed alongside her husband, James Anderson. She pitched the incubator relentlessly, convinced it was a multi-million-dollar breakthrough that would fundamentally alter medical research. She poured her fragile ego into the machine, using it as a psychological shield against the creeping, quiet realization that her academic career was actually stalling. When investors or senior faculty pointed out mechanical flaws or showed lukewarm interest, she didn't recalibrate. She viewed their hesitation as a conspiracy of the mediocre, trying to suppress a visionary. Every rejection was meticulously cataloged in her mind, never as constructive feedback, but as a deep, malicious betrayal. Her husband James was her primary sounding board and her fiercest defender. They had met during their undergraduate years and built an insular life together, raising 4 children while navigating the grueling demands of academic research. But their dynamic was dangerously isolated. They fed off each other's grievances. When Amy felt slighted by the biology department, James validated her anger. Instead of grounding her in reality, her home life served as a tight echo chamber for her growing paranoia and resentment. As the years in Huntsville ticked by, the pressure cooker of the university system began to build toward critical mass. Assistant professors operate on a ticking clock. They are given a set number of years to publish extensively, secure outside funding, and prove their worth before the tenure committee decides their fate. Tenure means a lifetime appointment. Denial means termination. For Amy, achieving tenure was not just about job security. It was the ultimate mandatory validation of her genius. Without it, the entire narrative she had constructed about her own brilliance would shatter. She approached the looming tenure review, not with the quiet confidence of a seasoned scientist, but with a frantic, white-knuckled entitlement. The University of Alabama in Huntsville Biology Department was a tight-knit ecosystem. Housed primarily within the modern walls of the Shelby Center, the faculty operated on collaboration, mutual respect, and shared resources. It was a functional, quiet academic family. When Dr. Amy Bishop joined their ranks, she was an invasive species. She made it immediately clear that she viewed her colleagues as intellectual inferiors. While other professors kept open-door policies and engaged in casual discourse in the hallways, Bishop isolated herself. Her lab was her fortress. She operated under the assumption that her Harvard pedigree granted her immunity from the standard social and professional expectations of a junior faculty member. She openly scoffed at the research of her peers, dismissing their work as derivative while elevating her own to an unearned level of grandeur. At the center of this department was Dr. Gopi Podila, the chairman. Podila was universally beloved. He was a deeply empathetic leader who actively championed his junior faculty, offering them resources, guidance, and unwavering support. He was the kind of administrator who genuinely wanted his staff to succeed, but his management style relied on collegiality. He expected his professors to work together, to secure joint grants, and to treat the students with respect. Bishop viewed his collaborative approach as a weakness. Instead of seeing Podila as a mentor, she categorized him as a bureaucratic obstacle, someone whose primary function should be to fast-track her inevitable rise to scientific stardom. The friction extended far beyond the faculty lounge. In the lecture halls, her behavior was aggressively erratic. Students reported that her teaching style was disjointed, her grading rubrics nonsensical, and her temperament highly volatile. If a student asked a clarifying question, she often responded with biting sarcasm or outright hostility, interpreting simple academic inquiries as challenges to her intellect. Complaints began to pile up on Dr. Podila's desk. The department attempted to guide her, offering constructive feedback to smooth her rough edges. Bishop rejected every critique. In her mind, the students were simply too slow to grasp her advanced concepts, and her colleagues were too mediocre to understand her methods. Everything hinged on the tenure review. In academia, the tenure track is an arduous, 6-year marathon. It is a grueling evaluation of a professor's published research, grant acquisition, and teaching efficacy. Earning tenure guarantees lifetime employment and academic freedom. Being denied means termination, a terminal contract granting one final year to pack up and find a new job. For Amy Bishop, the spring of 2009 was her judgment day. She submitted her dossier with the absolute certainty of a victor claiming her spoils. She leaned heavily on her automated cell incubator, touting it as a revolutionary breakthrough that would generate millions in revenue for the university. She listed her publications and her postdoctoral fellowships, fully expecting the committee to be dazzled. They were not. The tenure committee, comprised of senior faculty members, including Dr. Podila, meticulously reviewed her portfolio. The reality of her output was starkly different from her self-assessment. Her publication record was thin. Many of her papers were placed in lower-tier journals, and several were co-authored almost exclusively with her husband, raising concerns about her ability to conduct independent, high-level research. Her cell incubator, while interesting, had not secured the massive outside funding or peer validation she claimed it would. Furthermore, the stack of student complaints and her inability to function within a collaborative environment weighed heavily against her. In April 2009, the committee handed down its decision. Tenure was denied. The rejection did not spark introspection. It ignited a profound, consuming rage. For Bishop, the denial was not an assessment of her academic output. It was a targeted, malicious assassination of her character. The narrative she had built her entire life, the brilliant, untouchable Harvard genius, was being dismantled by a group of people she fundamentally despised. She refused to accept the decision. Bishop launched a frantic, aggressive appeals process. She treated the academic review like a hostile legal dispute, drafting lengthy, combative rebuttals. She accused the tenure committee of gross incompetence and deep-seated bias. Her husband James became her co-conspirator in this administrative war, helping her compile grievances and fueling her paranoia. At home, they constructed a narrative of victimhood. The university wasn't just blind to her genius, they were actively trying to destroy her out of pure jealousy. Her behavior on campus deteriorated rapidly. She began to view her colleagues not just as inferiors, but as active enemies. She fixated on Dr. Padilla, viewing the chairman as the orchestrator of her downfall. She also focused her resentment on Dr. Maria Ragland Davis and Dr. Adriel Johnson, two highly respected, successful faculty members who sat on the tenure committee. Bishop's interactions with them grew increasingly strained, marked by icy glares and barely suppressed hostility. Throughout the fall of 2009, the appeals wound their way through the university's administrative hierarchy. Every level of review upheld the biology department's initial decision. The provost reviewed it. The university president reviewed it. The outcome remained unchanged. Her terminal contract was set. The spring semester of 2010 would be her last. By January 2010, the reality of her impending termination settled over her like a suffocating blanket. She had exhausted her appeals. She was a middle-aged academic with a tarnished reputation, a thin publication record, and a documented history of severe interpersonal conflicts. Finding another tenure-track position at a comparable institution would be nearly impossible. The career she felt entitled to was ending in disgrace. The desperation mutated into a cold, hardened resolve. The administration had delivered their final verdict, but Amy Bishop was not a woman who allowed others to have the last word. If they were going to systematically destroy her life's work, she would ensure they understood the exact magnitude of their mistake. The ticking clock of her contract was running out, and the pressure inside her isolated, paranoid world had finally breached its limits. February 12, 2010. A standard Friday in northern Alabama. Temperatures hovered in the low 40s, and a gray winter chill hung over the campus of the University of Alabama in Huntsville. Dr. Amy Bishop began her day with unnerving normalcy. She taught her morning anatomy and physiology class to a room full of undergraduates. Her students later noted nothing amiss. She was her usual abrasive, impatient self, pushing through the syllabus with a rigid, unyielding tempo. But beneath the academic facade, a lethal mechanism had already engaged. Weeks prior, the preparation had quietly begun. Bishop and her husband, James, had visited a local indoor firing range. She had familiarized herself with the weight, the recoil, and the slide mechanics of a 9mm Ruger pistol. She had practiced the mechanics of a lethal strike. Today, that exact weapon was fully loaded. She placed the heavy firearm inside an oversized tote bag, completely obscuring the metallic contour. She walked across the campus pathways, just another disgruntled employee seamlessly blending into the collegiate background. At 3 p.m., the biology department gathered for their scheduled faculty meeting inside the Shelby Center for Science and Technology. Room 109 was a sterile, windowless environment. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The whiteboards were scarred with residual dry erase marker dust. A large U-shaped arrangement of tables filled the center of the room. 13 people filed in, taking their seats. Dr. Gopi Padilla took his usual place at the head of the table, preparing to lead a dry discussion on curriculum changes and spring budget allocations. Around the tables sat the intellectual core of the department. Dr. Maria Ragland Davis, Dr. Adriel Johnson, Dr. Joseph Leahy, Dr. Luis Cruz Vera, Dr. Deborah Moriarty. Staff assistant Stephanie Monticello sat nearby, notebook flipped open. Amy Bishop entered quietly. She did not take a seat in the back to avoid attention. Instead, she selected a chair near the front, right beside the only exit. She effectively and intentionally barricaded the room with her own presence. The meeting commenced. For nearly 40 minutes, the air in room 109 was thick with the soporific drone of university administration. Padilla discussed the upcoming semester. Colleagues politely debated minor policy adjustments. Bishop remained entirely silent. She sat forward, her hands resting near her bag. Those who casually glanced her way later realized she was intensely focused, but not on the meeting's agenda. Her eyes systematically tracked the room. She was mapping the spatial coordinates of her colleagues. There was no sudden argument, no flare-up of temper. The complete lack of an immediate trigger is what makes the ensuing violence so difficult to process. The meeting was simply winding down. People were checking their watches, thinking about the weekend traffic. It was approximately 3:40 p.m. The transition from administrative boredom to absolute carnage took less than 3 seconds. High-tension pacing. Bishop stood up. She did not yell. She offered no manifesto. She delivered no final words of grievance. She simply drew the 9mm Ruger. She leveled it at the head of Dr. Gopi Padilla. She pulled the trigger. The crack of the gunshot in the enclosed, concrete-walled room was deafening. Padilla collapsed instantly. The chairman, the man who had repeatedly tried to mentor her, was dead. Bishop pivoted. Her movements were described by survivors as entirely robotic. Clinical. She found her next target, Dr. Maria Ragland Davis. Another shot, point blank. Davis fell to the floor. Bishop turned again. Dr. Adriel Johnson, a third shot, another fatal strike to the head. This was not indiscriminate firing. Bishop was executing a hit list. She was systematically eliminating the senior faculty members who had voted against her tenure. She bypassed the newer professors. She bypassed those who had abstained from the vote. She aimed exclusively for the heads of her perceived enemies. The precision was terrifying. 3 highly respected scientists were dead within seconds. She then turned her weapon on the rest of the room. She fired at Dr. Joseph Leahy, striking him squarely in the head. He went down, critically wounded but violently clinging to life. She fired at Stephanie Montecholo. The assistant was struck in the face and collapsed against the furniture. She fired at Dr. Luis Cruz Vera, hitting him deep in the chest. The sterile academic bubble ruptured. Disbelief morphed into visceral chaos. The sharp smell of cordite, sulfur, and copper flooded the confined space. Chairs flipped backward as professors dove for the linoleum floor. Some scrambled beneath the tables, pressing themselves flat against the tile. There was nowhere to run. Bishop was standing between the survivors and the hallway. She stood over her bleeding colleagues, the gun still raised, sweeping the room for her next target. She leveled the weapon at Dr. Deborah Moriarty. Moriarty was a friend. She was one of the very few people on campus who had consistently tried to support and defend Bishop. Bishop pulled the trigger. Click, the gun jammed, or the magazine was empty. The sudden mechanical failure broke the executioner's trance. Moriarty, operating on pure, unfiltered adrenaline, lunged forward from beneath the table. She crawled rapidly across the blood-slicked floor, grabbed Bishop by the legs, and desperately pleaded with her to stop. Bishop looked down, her expression utterly vacant. She attempted to clear the chamber, manually racking the slide to chamber another round. Moriarty did not wait for the weapon to clear. She pushed upward, shoving Bishop backward toward the threshold of the door. The aggressive physical contact forced the shooter out into the hallway. As soon as Bishop stumbled backward into the corridor, Moriarty slammed the heavy wooden door shut. The survivors immediately shoved a table against the frame, barricading themselves inside the slaughterhouse. The silence that followed was agonizing. Blood pooled on the linoleum, spreading rapidly beneath the U-shaped tables. The uninjured desperately ripped off articles of clothing, applying makeshift tourniquets and frantic pressure to the catastrophic wounds of Leahy, Cruz Vera, and Montecholo. Someone pulled a cell phone with trembling hands and dialed the police. The dispatcher received the emergency call at exactly 3:48 p.m. Out in the corridor, Bishop made no attempt to force her way back inside. Her primary mission was complete. The architects of her academic failure had been punished. She walked away from the biology department with a terrifyingly calm stride. She entered a nearby women's restroom on the 2nd floor. She washed her hands in the sink. She dumped the 9mm Ruger in a metal trash can. Then, she pulled out her cell phone. She dialed her husband, James. She told him the faculty meeting was over. She calmly stated that she needed a ride home. The police response to the Shelby Center was overwhelming and immediate. Cruisers swarmed the campus perimeters. Tactical units breached the building, their assault rifles raised, expecting to hunt a heavily armed active shooter through a labyrinth of laboratories. Instead, they found a 45-year-old woman in unremarkable clothing, standing quietly near the exterior of the building. She was just waiting for her husband. Officers closed in, weapons drawn, demanding she get on the concrete. Bishop complied without a single struggle. There was no hostage situation, no frantic suicide attempt. As she was handcuffed and pulled up from the pavement, her face betrayed absolutely zero emotion. She looked around at the flashing red and blue lights, the screaming sirens, and the terrified students fleeing the building as if she were a minor inconvenience in an otherwise normal afternoon. As she was placed into the back of a squad car, an officer asked if she understood what was happening. She stared blankly through the plexiglass partition. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. A Harvard-educated neurobiologist had just committed a mass execution with the cold precision of a cartel hitman. The community of Huntsville was about to ask how a monster had infiltrated their ranks, but the deeper, far more terrifying question was about to surface. This was not the first time Amy Bishop had held a loaded gun, and it was certainly not the first time she had left a body in her wake. Huntsville detectives sat across from Amy Bishop in an aggressively lit, sterile interrogation room, searching for a microscopic fracture in her armor. They expected a breakdown. They anticipated tearful justifications about a ruined career, or perhaps a sudden, violent snap into manic remorse. What they got was an absolute chilling void. She sat with her hands folded. She requested a lawyer in a flat, monotone register. She stared at the institutional walls with eyes that registered zero comprehension of the slaughter she had just orchestrated. To the investigators, it was as if they were interrogating a piece of heavy, unfeeling machinery. Her pulse was steady. Her breathing was entirely regulated. By nightfall, the story of the Harvard-educated professor who executed her colleagues was dominating national news syndicates. The mugshot of Amy Bishop, disheveled, glaring, unapologetic, was plastered across television screens from coast to coast. The public grappled with the terrifying paradox of a suburban academic turning into a mass shooter, but 1,100 miles away, in the quiet, affluent suburbs of Boston, Massachusetts, that broadcast triggered a visceral, sickening shockwave. Local journalists, retired police officers, and old neighbors in the town of Braintree stared at their screens, their blood turning to ice. They recognized that face. They knew that blank, terrifying stare. Huntsville investigators were desperately digging into her background, looking for a history of violence, a hidden criminal record, any red flags that could explain the carnage at the Shelby Center. On paper, her record was pristine, an untarnished academic climb. But then, the calls from Massachusetts began pouring into the precinct, completely shattering the illusion of the quirky, harmless scientist. The midpoint pivot of the investigation hit the detectives like a physical blow. Amy Bishop was not a first-time killer. The timeline violently shifted backward to December 6, 1986. The Bishop family home in Braintree was a pressure cooker of extreme expectations. Judy Bishop, Amy's mother, was a prominent, highly connected figure on the local town council. The children were pushed toward absolute excellence. Amy, then 21 years old, was intensely competitive and easily frustrated, but the golden child of the family was her 18-year-old brother, Seth. He was an accomplished violinist, widely well-liked and seemingly effortlessly successful. The underlying sibling rivalry was a quiet, toxic current humming beneath the floorboards of the household. That Saturday afternoon, Judy had just returned from a council meeting. Amy was upstairs in her bedroom with a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun. Her father had purchased it for home defense, a heavy, devastating piece of hardware that required deliberate, physical exertion to operate. Amy later claimed to investigators that she was trying to learn how to unload it. This was the narrative she constructed. The weapon was jammed. She walked downstairs to ask her mother for help, and it accidentally discharged. The physical mechanics of the incident completely defied her explanation. Amy entered the kitchen. Seth was standing near the counter. Amy raised the heavy, blued steel barrel of the 12-gauge. She claimed she was trying to safely eject a shell, but a pump-action shotgun does not simply slip. It requires the user to depress a release button, rack the heavy slide backward with significant force to eject, and push it forward to chamber a new round. Furthermore, to fire, the heavy trigger must be pulled. It requires absolute physical intent. The gun discharged. The deafening roar shattered the suburban quiet. A massive slug struck Seth directly in the chest at close range. The kinetic energy threw him backward. He bled out on the kitchen floor, the air instantly thick with the sharp smell of iron and burning powder. What followed was not the frantic, hysterical behavior of a sister who had just accidentally shot her beloved brother. Amy did not drop the weapon in shock. She did not drop to her knees and apply pressure to the catastrophic wound. She did not scream for an ambulance. She kept the shotgun, she turned, and fled out the back door. Amy ran through the suburban streets of Braintree, still clutching the 12-gauge. She moved with frantic, terrifying purpose. She approached a nearby auto dealership. An employee was locking up a vehicle in the lot. Amy leveled the shotgun directly at the man's face, aggressively demanding the keys to the car. The employee, staring down the barrel of a weapon that had ended a life minutes prior, managed to dive behind a concrete wall and flee for his life. Responding Braintree patrol officers converged on the dealership. They found the 21-year-old woman hiding behind a dumpster. They drew their service weapons, screaming commands for her to drop the shotgun. She eventually complied, mirroring the exact blank compliance she would exhibit 24 years later in Alabama. She was arrested, handcuffed, and transported in the back of a cruiser to the precinct. At this point in the 1986 timeline, a standard homicide investigation should have commenced. An 18-year-old man was dead. The primary suspect had fled the bloody scene with the murder weapon and attempted an armed, violent carjacking. The evidence for severe manslaughter and armed robbery was overwhelming, but the machinery of justice in Braintree violently stalled. Judy Bishop, grieving the horrific death of her son, immediately shifted into political preservation mode. She arrived at the police station. She bypassed standard protocol and demanded direct access to the chief of police, utilizing her heavy status on the town council. The exact nature of those closed-door conversations remains buried in history, but the outcome was an astonishing corruption of procedure. The chief ordered the booking process to be halted immediately. Amy was never photographed. She was never fingerprinted. She was quietly released through a back door directly into the custody of her mother. The Braintree police drafted a heavily sanitized report. They officially ruled the fatal discharge a tragic freak accident. They dismissed the armed carjacking attempt as a grief-induced panic attack. The district attorney's office eventually received the files, but they were glaringly, suspiciously incomplete. Essential initial reports were missing. Crime scene photos vanished. The physical evidence was severely mishandled. Without a comprehensive file, the state declined to press charges. The entire incident was quietly swept under the rug, buried beneath the political weight and social standing of the Bishop family. Amy returned to her university studies. She carried no criminal record. No psychological evaluations were ever mandated. The system explicitly validated her absolute lack of accountability. She learned a devastating psychological lesson in the winter of 1986. She could extinguish human life, point a loaded weapon at a stranger, and simply walk away, completely untouchable. Back in 2010, the Huntsville detectives sat at their desks, reviewing the newly unearthed 1986 files faxed over from Massachusetts. The realization was physically sickening. Dr. Gopi Padilla, Dr. Maria Ragland Davis, and Dr. Adriel Johnson were dead because a small-town police department had decided to look the other way. The UAH massacre was not a sudden, unpredictable psychological snap. It was the horrific, delayed echo of a murder that had been successfully covered up 24 years prior. The interrogation of Amy Bishop yielded nothing resembling a confession. Inside the stark concrete walls of the Huntsville Police Precinct, detectives encountered a psychological void. Murder suspects typically display a predictable spectrum of post-incident reactions: hysteria, catatonic shock, frantic justification, or profound remorse. Bishop displayed mild annoyance. She did not inquire about the survival of the colleagues she had shot. She did not ask about the catastrophic damage inflicted upon the biology department. Instead, she complained about the temperature of the holding cell. She spoke to the investigators with the exasperated tone of an academic forced to endure a tedious administrative hurdle. Her cognitive detachment was absolute. She framed the afternoon's carnage not as a massacre, but as a severe career dispute that had unfortunately escalated. She discussed the intricacies of her denied tenure application, referencing the automated cell incubator and her publication record as if the detectives were an appellate board reviewing her credentials. The sociopathic disconnect was terrifying. The authorities realized they were not dealing with a woman who had experienced a temporary psychotic break. They were looking at a highly functional predator whose narcissism completely overrode her capacity for human empathy. While Bishop sat unbothered in a cell, the social echo of her actions reverberated through Huntsville. Known as Rocket City for its deep ties to NASA and defense engineering, the community was a bastion of logic, reason, and scientific inquiry. The realization that a mass execution had occurred within the sanctuary of the Shelby Center fundamentally fractured that sense of security. The campus was cordoned off with miles of yellow crime scene tape. Students and faculty held candlelight vigils, grappling with a profound sense of betrayal. The university was supposed to be a meritocracy of ideas. Instead, it had become the hunting ground for an ego that refused to be contained. The psychological scars left on the survivors, the academics who had pressed makeshift tourniquets to the catastrophic head wounds of their friends, permanently altered the atmosphere of the institution. Investigators quickly shifted their crosshairs to the only other person in Bishop's insular world, her husband, James Anderson. Detectives hauled him in for extensive questioning. The timeline of the weapons acquisition placed him directly in the center of the conspiracy. Anderson admitted that he had purchased the 9mm Ruger pistol just weeks before the shooting. He confirmed that he had accompanied his wife to a local indoor firing range, standing beside her as she practiced her marksmanship. The interrogation grew intensely confrontational. Detectives demanded to know if Anderson was an active accomplice or the architect of the massacre. He vehemently denied any prior knowledge of the hit list. Anderson painted a grim picture of their domestic life, describing a household ruled entirely by his wife's volatile temperament. He claimed she had requested the firearm for personal protection, citing vague, paranoid fears about her safety. He positioned himself not as a co-conspirator, but as an enabling, beaten-down spouse who lacked the psychological fortitude to question her demands. While law enforcement viewed him as morally culpable for arming an obviously unstable woman, the evidence fell short of legally proving he had orchestrated the attack. He remained a free man, heavily insulated by plausible deniability. But as the Huntsville detectives continued to peel back the layers of Bishop's past, the 1986 Braintree shooting was not the only skeleton they unearthed. The federal databases flagged another massive, chilling red herring. The timeline shifted back to 1993. Years before arriving in Alabama, Bishop was working as a postdoctoral researcher at a Boston Children's Hospital, affiliated with Harvard Medical School. She found herself under the supervision of Dr. Paul Rosenberg. True to her established pattern, she was notoriously difficult to manage. She argued relentlessly, refused to accept direction, and openly defied laboratory protocols. Rosenberg eventually drafted a severely negative evaluation of her performance, effectively forcing her resignation. Weeks later, a package arrived at Rosenberg's suburban home. His wife opened it. Inside were two 6-inch galvanized steel pipes packed tightly with black powder and wired to a crude explosive mechanism. It was a functional, lethal pipe bomb. By sheer luck, the triggering mechanism failed to spark. The device did not detonate. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives descended on the Boston area, launching a massive domestic terrorism investigation. The ATF profilers quickly narrowed their focus. The bomb required sophisticated scientific knowledge to construct, and the target was highly specific. The suspect list immediately zeroed in on the disgruntled former researcher and her husband. Federal agents executed search warrants on the couple's residence. They discovered extensive literature regarding the construction of explosive devices. When interrogated, Anderson calmly explained that he was an aspiring author writing a thriller novel, and the bomb-making manuals were simply research materials for his manuscript. Bishop was equally uncooperative and combative. The ATF knew they had the right suspects. The profile was a perfect match, but the physical evidence, the lack of definitive fingerprints or DNA on the unexploded pipes, was insufficient to secure an indictment. The investigation hit a frustrating, impenetrable dead end. The case was closed without an arrest. Sitting in the Alabama precinct in 2010, the synthesis of these historical files hit the homicide detectives with sickening clarity. A terrifying, decades-long pattern materialized. In 1986, a perceived slight or familial argument culminated in a fatal shotgun blast. The system labeled it an accident. In 1993, a negative performance review culminated in a targeted explosive device. The system failed to prosecute. In 2010, a denied tenure application culminated in a systematic, point-blank execution of 3 department heads. The arrogance radiating from Amy Bishop in the interrogation room was not a delusion. It was a deeply ingrained, learned behavior. Every time she had utilized lethal violence to resolve a personal grievance, she had slipped through the cracks. The justice system had inadvertently trained her to believe she was a genius, operating entirely above the law. The Huntsville massacre was the horrific endpoint of a societal failure that had allowed a sociopath to hide behind a Harvard degree for 24 years. The legal reckoning for Amy Bishop was swift and aggressively unforgiving. Madison County prosecutors immediately pursued a capital murder conviction, seeking the ultimate penalty. For 2 years, her defense team maneuvered through procedural delays, desperate to save her from death row. But the sheer magnitude of the physical evidence and the dozens of surviving eyewitnesses made an insanity defense impossible to sustain. In September 2012, facing the undeniable reality of a lethal injection, the arrogance finally fractured. Bishop entered a guilty plea for 3 counts of capital murder and 3 counts of attempted murder. The judge handed down a definitive sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Simultaneously, a massive legal shift occurred 1,100 miles north. Armed with the irrefutable proof of her violent pathology, a Massachusetts grand jury officially reopened the Braintree files. After a quarter-century of silence, Bishop was formally indicted for the first-degree murder of her brother. However, since Alabama had already locked her away in a maximum security cell for the rest of her natural life, Northern prosecutors ultimately declined to extradite her for a secondary trial. The indictment served purely as a historical correction, a delayed, paper-bound acknowledgement of a heavily protected homicide. The Shelby Center stands today as a quiet monument to an unimaginable breach of trust. Universities operate on the presumption of shared intellect and rational thought, but a brilliant mind does not preclude a predator. Amy Bishop weaponized her academic pedigree to shield a deeply embedded capacity for lethal violence. She demanded the world recognize her as a visionary. Instead, locked away in an Alabama penitentiary, she is only remembered as the architect of her own devastating hubris. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon. A grieving husband stands before a barrage of cameras, weeping over his murdered 20-year-old wife. He describes a brutal home invasion, ruthless thieves breaking in, tying him up, and smothering her beside their infant. It is a flawless, terrifying performance that paralyzes a nation until the victim's own pulse betrays him. A biometric smartwatch strapped to her wrist silently recorded the exact moment her heart stopped, hours before the alleged killers ever smashed the door. This was no random tragedy. It was a meticulously directed execution. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Before the illusion of the perfect family shattered on national television, the foundations of this fatal dynamic were laid across 2 vastly different landscapes. Caroline Crouch was born in the United Kingdom in the summer of 2001, but her identity was forged on the rugged, sun-baked island of Alonissos. Situated about 175 miles north of Athens, the island is a tightly knit community surrounded by the deep waters of the Aegean Sea. For a child, it was a paradise of steep cliffs and isolated pebble beaches. Her parents relocated there seeking a quieter life, and their daughter adapted instantly. She grew up wild and free, deeply connected to the natural world. Those who watched her mature remembered a girl vibrating with kinetic energy. She was an advanced scuba diver, a dedicated scout, and a kickboxing enthusiast. There was nothing fragile about her. She spent her weekends hiking the island's uneven trails and rescuing stray animals, developing a fierce independence that defined her teenage years. Her dual heritage, British roots planted in Greek soil gave her a unique charm, making her a beloved fixture among the locals. She was bright, ambitious, and looking toward a future that seemed entirely boundless. In stark contrast to her untamed island upbringing was the highly structured, calculated world of Charalambos Anagnostopoulos, known to everyone simply as Babies. Born 13 years before her, he grew up in the sprawling urban expanse of the Greek capital. He carved out a lucrative and highly respected career as a civil aviation pilot and flight instructor. Commanding twin-engine helicopters, he ferried wealthy tourists and corporate executives between the mainland and the scattered luxury resorts of the islands. His profession required specific psychological architecture. Piloting a helicopter is an exercise in absolute, unyielding control. A pilot must process multiple streams of complex data, compartmentalize stress, and maintain a facade of supreme confidence, regardless of the turbulence outside the cockpit. Babis excelled at this. He was accustomed to being the smartest man in the room, or at least projecting the illusion that he was. To the outside world, his image was flawless. He wore his uniform well, carried himself with a quiet, authoritative grace, and spoke in the measured, reassuring tones of a man with thousands of flight hours under his belt. He was the kind of professional that protective parents instinctively trusted, a man who seemed to offer financial stability, maturity, and safety. There was no outward indication of a volatile temper or an unpredictable nature. His entire existence was built on precision, routine, and managing the perceptions of those around him. These two contrasting figures represented completely different elements. She was the sea, restless, transparent, and fiercely independent. He was the machine, calculated, rigid, and demanding total compliance. Their orbits were entirely separate until his flight routes began bringing him to Alonissos. The island, usually a sanctuary for the young girl, suddenly became the backdrop for an intersection that would eventually trap her. The distance between their ages and their worlds should have kept them apart. She was still navigating the complexities of high school, while he was a seasoned professional in his late 20s, operating in an adult sphere of high-stakes aviation and mainland wealth. Yet the isolation of island life often accelerates connections. He presented a polished, worldly alternative to the small-town boys she knew. And for him, her vibrant, untested spirit was something beautiful that he could mold, direct, and ultimately possess. The polished pilot and the island girl seemed like an unlikely match, but his facade was meticulously engineered to bypass the defenses of a young mind, setting the stage for a relationship built on a quiet, escalating capture. The intersection of their lives began during a crowded summer festival on her native island. He did not arrive as an ordinary tourist. He entered her sphere with the polished, commanding presence of an established aviator. He leveraged his profession masterfully, frequently routing his flight paths to pass low over the island's coastline. The heavy, rhythmic thud of helicopter rotors cutting through the coastal wind became a personal calling card, an auditory flex of wealth and status designed to captivate a teenager. He played a patient, highly calculated game. Rather than aggressively pursuing her, he systematically charmed her support network. He presented himself to her parents as a grounded, mature protector, a man who had already conquered the professional world and could offer their daughter unparalleled security. His infiltration of her family unit was so seamless that they practically handed her over. As her high school graduation approached, the invisible wires of his control began to tighten. The transition from the rugged freedom of the island to the sprawling concrete grid of the mainland marked his first major psychological victory. When she moved to Athens to pursue a university degree in statistics, she was instantly severed from her lifelong friends and the protective bubble of her tight-knit community. In a metropolitan expanse of 4 million people, she was adrift, and the pilot positioned himself as her only anchor. He orchestrated the relocation flawlessly, ensuring she relied on him entirely for navigation, logistics, and emotional support. The courtship was quickly solidified by a highly secretive wedding ceremony in Portugal, a location chosen not for romance, but for isolation. By holding the ceremony hundreds of miles away from her extended family, he ensured the event was strictly under his direction. Upon returning to Greece, they purchased a multi-level property in a quiet, affluent suburban neighborhood, From the street, the newly built home radiated modern domestic success. Inside, it functioned as a sophisticated, sterile cage. The pilot immediately executed a total financial blackout. The young bride was forbidden from holding a personal bank account, possessing credit cards, or carrying cash. If she needed to purchase groceries or pay for a cab ride to her classes, she was required to submit a verbal request. He would then transfer the exact, meticulously calculated amount to a temporary digital wallet. His obsession with dominance quickly metastasized into electronic surveillance. He installed location tracking software on her smartphone, transforming a modern convenience into a digital leash. Every mile she traveled, every minute she lingered at a cafe, was logged and analyzed. The fierce, independent girl who once scaled uneven island cliffs was now confined to a tightly managed urban radius. To cope with the crushing, silent solitude of the suburban house, she adopted a small, mixed-breed puppy. It was a desperate attempt to bring something warm, chaotic, and unconditionally loving into a deeply sterilized environment. The birth of their daughter introduced a volatile new variable into his carefully calibrated system. Motherhood fundamentally altered her psychology, overriding his programming with raw, protective instincts. But he quickly weaponized the postpartum period against her. As the grueling exhaustion of caring for an infant set in, his psychological grip only tightened. The young mother began documenting her suffocating reality in a digital diary, locking her rawest thoughts behind encrypted passwords. Through indirect phrasing, her entries revealed a woman waking up to her own entrapment. She documented violent, shouting arguments, the physical revulsion she felt when he entered the room, and her growing realization that she had to leave before she was completely erased. The tension reached a critical mass when she demanded professional intervention. The couple began attending sessions with a clinical psychotherapist. It was a rare, fatal miscalculation on the pilot's part. He walked into the clinic fully expecting to manipulate the counselor into diagnosing his wife as unstable or hysterical. Instead, the seasoned therapist immediately identified the severe coercive control and narcissistic abuse dominating the marriage. During private, agonizing moments in the office, the young mother confessed her absolute terror. She revealed she was actively searching for a secure rental apartment to flee with her baby. When the therapist attempted to address the toxic power imbalance during a joint session, the husband's facade cracked. He abruptly terminated the therapy. He recognized the immediate threat. His perfect image was being actively dismantled, and his primary asset was preparing a quiet exit. The final weeks in the suburban house were defined by a suffocating, hostile silence. She began researching moving logistics and touring safe housing. He monitored these digital breadcrumbs with escalating panic. For a man whose entire identity relied on projecting absolute authority and perfection, the prospect of being publicly abandoned by a woman he considered his property was an intolerable humiliation. The control he had spent years engineering was rapidly unraveling, and the machine was preparing a devastating, permanent correction. The suburban street in Glycanera was completely silent. It was the dead of night, a time when the sprawling metropolitan grid outside Athens powers down, leaving residential blocks bathed in the faint amber glow of sodium streetlights. The tri-level property stood locked and seemingly impenetrable. Inside, the atmosphere was dark, heavily air-conditioned, and deeply still. The young mother, the pilot, and their infant daughter slept in the expansive attic suite on the highest floor, nestled beneath the slanted architectural lines of the roof. Downstairs, the mixed-breed puppy roamed the ground level. It was a picture of absolute, fortified domestic security. Then, the narrative he provided to the authorities began to unfold. It was a tale of sudden, overwhelming violence, a home invasion executed with the cold efficiency of a paramilitary operation. According to his official statement, the breach occurred in the darkest hours of the morning. He claimed a crew of highly organized thieves targeted the property. They bypassed the heavy front entrance, moving to the rear of the house. They found a narrow basement window located just a few feet above the exterior concrete. The glass was quietly removed. The frame was fractured. Dark figures slipped into the subterranean level of the home. The intruders were supposedly professionals. They moved with a predatory silence, immediately locating the primary security console. They ripped the memory card from the surveillance system, blinding the digital eyes of the house. But there was a biological alarm system they had to neutralize: the puppy. The pilot recounted the first horrifying act of the invasion. As the men ascended from the basement to the ground floor, the dog began to react. To prevent a warning bark from echoing up the stairwell, the intruders moved with ruthless speed. He described them grabbing the animal, utilizing its own leash, and violently suspending it from the wooden banister of the living room staircase. It was a cold, calculated execution, designed to clear the path upward without waking the neighborhood. Footsteps vibrated through the hardwood floors. They climbed one flight, then another, approaching the attic. The bedroom door violently kicked open. Flashlights sliced through the pitch-black room, blinding the sleeping couple. 3 men, dressed entirely in dark tactical clothing, faces heavily obscured by tight balaclavas. They gripped heavy handguns, sweeping the barrels across the bed. The pilot described a blur of adrenaline and panic. Short, barked commands, rough hands pulling him from the mattress. He claimed they threw him face down onto the floor planks, pressing the cold steel of a weapon against his temple. They moved quickly to neutralize him. Heavy adhesive duct tape was wrapped tight around his eyes, blinding him entirely. More tape was slashed across his mouth, sealing his lips. His wrists and ankles were bound tightly behind his back with rope and fabric. He was rendered completely paralyzed, a helpless hostage lying in the dark, forced to listen to the nightmare unfolding inches away. The intruders wanted money. They demanded the hidden cash. The pilot indicated through muffled, panicked sounds that he would cooperate. He directed them to a specific hiding spot, a hollowed-out board game box tucked away in a closet. Inside was a massive bundle of cash, tens of thousands in paper currency recently withdrawn for a scheduled land purchase. It was a specific, highly lucrative score. But the money was not enough. The young mother was awake. She was terrified, but she was not passive. The pilot detailed how her martial arts training kicked in. She began to fight back, thrashing violently against the men attempting to restrain her. The attic descended into chaos. The sounds of a desperate physical struggle echoed off the slanted ceiling. To force her compliance, one of the men pointed a heavy revolver directly at the head of the crying infant. She continued to scream. She continued to fight. The thieves, growing desperate to silence her before the noise breached the exterior walls, escalated their violence. The pilot lay paralyzed on the floor, listening to the agonizing finale. He described the sounds of heavy bodies pinning his wife face down into the soft mattress. He heard the terrifying, muffled noises of forced asphyxiation. The intruders pressed a heavy pillow over her face, applying relentless downward pressure. He recounted the sounds of her lungs fighting for oxygen, the frantic kicking of her legs against the bed frame, and then the heavy, devastating silence that followed. The attackers ransacked the rest of the room, tearing through drawers and ripping expensive jewelry from their velvet boxes. Within minutes, the heavy boots retreated down the stairs. The front door clicked. The house fell back into a dead, horrifying quiet, punctuated only by the frantic wailing of the infant left on the bed. For hours, the pilot claimed he lay bound on the floor, fighting against the heavy tape and tight ropes. The sun slowly rose, bleeding pale morning light through the attic blinds. He described an exhausting, agonizing physical struggle to reach his dropped smartphone. Blinded and gagged, he supposedly dragged his bound body across the floorboards. Using only his nose and chin, he managed to strike the screen, desperately punching in the 3 digits for the emergency dispatch. The emergency operator picked up. There was no voice on the other end, only heavy, muffled breathing, panicked grunts, and the distant, echoing cries of a baby. The rapid response unit of the Hellenic police arrived within minutes. Heavily armed officers surrounded the perimeter. They noted the broken basement window. Weapons drawn, they breached the heavy front door, shattering the locking mechanism. The officers stepped into the foyer. The smell of adrenaline and stale air hit them immediately. Flashlights cut through the gloom. The first thing they saw, suspended from the staircase banister, was the lifeless body of the puppy. The visual confirmed their worst fears. This was an active, violently hostile crime scene. They cleared the ground floor in seconds. Rifles raised, they moved up the wooden stairs, their heavy boots making the only sound besides the relentless crying drifting down from the top floor. They cleared the second level, nothing. They stacked up outside the attic door. They pushed inside. The scene perfectly matched the horrific narrative. The room was utterly destroyed. Drawers were pulled from their tracks. Clothing was scattered. On the floor near the bed lay the pilot, bound, blindfolded, and hyperventilating behind layers of thick silver tape. And on the bed, lying face down amidst the tangled, ruined sheets, was the young mother. She was completely motionless. Next to her, patting her cold shoulder and crying out for a response that would never come, was the infant. It was a tableau of absolute devastation, a perfect, tragic crime scene that would immediately ignite a nationwide panic and send the police hunting for a phantom crew of merciless killers. The extraction was chaotic, bathed in the harsh blue strobes of emergency vehicles. Paramedics rushed into the stifling attic, peeling the heavy silver tape from the pilot's face. He gasped for air, playing the role of a traumatized survivor with terrifying precision. He asked about his wife, his voice cracking, his body trembling, while medics gently lifted the crying infant from the ruined bed. The physical evidence surrounding them seemed irrefutable. The suffocated dog swinging from the banister, the shattered basement window, the ransacked drawers. It was a perfectly staged diorama of extreme violence, designed to overwhelm the senses of the first responders and dictate the entire trajectory of the investigation. By dawn, the quiet street was choked with satellite trucks and idling police cruisers. The narrative hit the national news cycle with the force of a bomb. A young mother murdered, a heroic aviator bound and helpless, a baby left to cry next to a corpse. It bypassed logic and struck directly at the deepest suburban fears. The social echo was instantaneous and paralyzing. The affluent enclave of Glyca Nera transformed into a fortress. Residents who had slept with windows cracked open for the Aegean breeze suddenly locked their doors. Hardware stores within a 50-mile radius sold out of heavy deadbolts, security cameras, and motion sensors in a matter of hours. The illusion of safety evaporated. The community was gripped by the terrifying myth of a heavily armed phantom militia scaling their fences in the dead of night. The brutality of the described crime forced an unprecedented government reaction. Authorities issued a massive financial bounty, the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars, for any information leading to the capture of the gang. A specialized high-pressure task force was assembled. Their entire initial strategy was dictated by the grieving widower. He fed them a highly specific profile of his attackers. He claimed there were 3 men. He noted they were short, incredibly violent, and spoke a foreign language, specifically pointing toward an Eastern European origin. It was a calculated misdirection, exploiting regional anxieties to send the police chasing ghosts through the criminal underworld. While detectives scoured border crossings and squeezed informants, the pilot took center stage. He did not retreat into private mourning. Instead, he stepped directly in front of the television cameras. Standing just feet away from where he had extinguished his wife's life, his face drawn and exhausted, he delivered a masterclass in psychological manipulation. He addressed the nation, begging the public to help find the monsters who destroyed his family. His audacity peaked during the funeral on the island. Surrounded by her devastated community, he stood by the grave holding his infant child. He physically leaned on his mother-in-law, embracing the very woman whose daughter he had violently erased. His performance was flawless, devoid of any visible cracks. Public sympathy swelled into a massive wave of national mourning. He believed he was completely untouchable. Meanwhile, the task force hit the midpoint pivot of the investigation, spiraling into frustration. They were hunting a crew that did not exist. They pulled files on every known property theft ring operating within 100 miles of the capital. The intense pressure to produce results yielded a false positive. Border police apprehended a Georgian national attempting to cross into a neighboring country. The man possessed a criminal record for burglary and vaguely matched the physical parameters provided by the pilot. He was detained, transferred to a high-security interrogation room, and pressed relentlessly for a confession. The media immediately leaked the arrest, allowing the terrified public to briefly exhale. But inside the concrete walls of police headquarters, the phantom narrative began to stall. The detained man vehemently denied any involvement in the suburban execution. His alibi held up to scrutiny. Then, the forensic results returned from the lab. The DNA was a complete mismatch. The fingerprints lifted from the fractured basement window frame did not align with his. The authorities had no choice but to release him. The task force was back to zero. Weeks had passed, the trail was freezing over, and the massive financial reward remained unclaimed. In the grit and reality of violent crime, a crew sophisticated enough to bypass perimeter security, execute a brutal home invasion, and vanish without leaving a single trace of forensic material simply does not exist without someone in the underworld whispering about it. Yet street informants were completely silent. The money was on the table, but nobody was talking. The silence was the first real clue. The lead detective sat in a room plastered with crime scene photographs and timeline boards, staring at the dead ends. The external threat wasn't making sense. The physics of the break-in felt wrong. The lack of biological evidence from a brutal struggle was impossible. Slowly, the focus in the room shifted. They stopped looking outward at the phantom burglars and turned their attention back to the only adult who walked out of that attic alive. The physical crime scene was a masterpiece of violent misdirection, but physical spaces have limitations. They are strictly bound by the laws of physics and biology. The lead investigators, staring at empty evidence boards and sterile lab reports, realized they had been looking at the wrong layer of reality. Traditional forensics were offering zero traction. The fingerprint dust yielded nothing but the family's own prints. The DNA swabs came back completely clean. There was no foreign blood spatter to analyze because the murder weapon was a soft, heavy pillow. The phantom burglars had moved through the house like ghosts because they did not exist. The tactical pivot was sharp and absolute. The Hellenic police stopped hunting for men in the shadows and turned their entire focus toward the invisible, indestructible realm of digital data. They shifted from theatrical lies to clinical mathematics. The tri-level suburban property was a highly connected, modern environment, and the first devastating anomaly emerged from the home's own surveillance architecture. The pilot had explicitly stated that the intruders neutralized the security camera in the living room immediately upon entering through the basement window. He claimed they ripped the physical memory card out of the console to blind the system, covering their tracks perfectly. It was a logical, expected sequence of events for a professional crew. However, routers, security software, and cloud applications maintain internal log files, digital ledgers that record every single action taken on the network, down to the millisecond. When the cybercrimes unit bypassed the missing physical SD card and extracted the core command logs from the central server, the narrative suffered its first fatal fracture. The data revealed exactly when the camera was disconnected. It was not violently disabled during a chaotic early morning breach. The log showed a manual, authorized command executed through a remote smartphone application. Someone with administrative access had deliberately powered down the recording hardware and ejected the memory card, hours before the supposed thieves ever set foot on the property. The system was blinded from the inside out. The second and most profound betrayal came from the victim herself. Though her voice had been violently silenced, the hardware strapped to her wrist continued to testify. She was wearing a biometric smartwatch, a sophisticated piece of wearable technology designed to monitor sleep cycles, track fitness progression, and measure heart rate by reading the blood flow beneath the skin. Investigators bypassed physical warrants and directly subpoenaed the tech manufacturer, pulling the encrypted health data straight from the cloud servers. The resulting graph was not just a piece of circumstantial evidence, it was a digital autopsy. It mapped her final hours with brutal, indisputable precision. The timeline laid out by the husband completely disintegrated against the hard metrics. The sensors recorded her in a state of deep, resting sleep. Then, the lines shifted abruptly. The heart rate spiked into the extreme ranges, indicating severe physical distress and an overwhelming adrenaline dump. The watch logged the chaotic, erratic movements of a desperate, terrifying struggle for survival. It recorded the agonizing minutes of forced asphyxiation, the raw biological panic of a failing respiratory system fighting against heavy downward pressure. And then, the line simply dropped. The biometric sensors registered a complete cessation of a pulse, a total flatline. The exact time of biological death was permanently etched into the server logs. This irrefutable timestamp proved she was dead hours before the alleged break-in even commenced. The husband had been sleeping next to a corpse, waiting for the right moment to stage the invasion. The final piece of the digital puzzle completely dismantled the pilot's carefully constructed alibi. He had sworn to the first responders, and later to the entire nation on television, that he had been ambushed in his bed. He described being thrown to the floor planks, tightly bound with heavy rope, blindfolded with thick silver tape, and left utterly paralyzed while the attackers ransacked the house and executed his wife. He claimed he was completely immobile for hours, fighting against his restraints until dawn, but his own smartphone was resting in his pocket. Modern cellular devices are equipped with highly sensitive internal hardware, accelerometers, gyroscopes, and pedometers, designed to constantly track user activity. Tech units extracted the raw spatial data from his phone. During the exact window of time, he swore he was tied up and lying face down on the floor. His device was actively moving. The pedometer logged distinct, calculated steps. The gyroscope and altimeter registered significant elevation changes. The data painted a perfect spatial map of his movements through the house. He was not paralyzed, he was pacing. The timeline of his steps perfectly aligned with the destruction of the property. The data showed him walking down the stairs to the ground floor, matching the exact time the puppy was suffocated and suspended from the banister. It showed him moving to the basement, the exact time the window frame was fractured from the inside out to simulate a point of entry. It showed him moving back up to the attic to bind himself, scatter the jewelry, and eventually dial the emergency dispatch. He had spent hours methodically directing a nightmare, and his own pocket computer had silently recorded every single spatial shift. The investigators now held absolute, mathematical proof. The violent foreign mob was a ghost story. The grieving, traumatized widower was a cold-blooded executioner. But the revelation triggered a highly volatile tactical dilemma. The authorities possessed the evidence to secure an arrest warrant, but the suspect was not in Athens. He was 175 miles away, standing on the rugged cliffs of Alonissos. He was attending a memorial service for the woman he had murdered, completely surrounded by her grieving parents, her friends, and the tight-knit island community. The police knew they were dealing with an intelligent, highly controlling narcissist. If he caught even the slightest hint that the investigation had turned toward him, the situation could escalate into a secondary disaster. He was a licensed aviator. He had the financial resources and the technical ability to charter a flight, steal a boat, or slip across international borders before a mainland strike team could cross the Aegean Sea. Furthermore, making a violent, high-profile arrest at the victim's memorial service, in front of the mother whose grief he was actively exploiting, was an operational risk they were unwilling to take. They needed a flawless strategy of extraction. They had to lure the predator away from the island and back to the heavily fortified mainland, using his own massive ego and need for control against him. The detectives drafted a psychological trap. They decided to contact him during the memorial service under the guise of a major investigative breakthrough. They would tell him the exact lie he desperately wanted to hear, that they had finally caught the phantom killers at the border, and they urgently needed his expertise to identify a suspect in a lineup. The plan relied entirely on his arrogant belief that he had outsmarted the entire justice system, that he was still the smartest man in the room, seamlessly directing the show. The extraction was flawlessly executed. Detectives approached the widower following the island memorial, quietly explaining they had apprehended a suspect and urgently needed his visual confirmation. His ego took the bait. He boarded a police helicopter to Athens, fully believing he was still directing the narrative. But the moment the heavy doors of the interrogation room locked behind him, the illusion evaporated. There was no lineup. Instead, investigators silently slid a printed graph across the metal table, the biometric flatline from his wife's smartwatch, juxtaposed against his own smartphone pedometer logs. The data was absolute. The pilot stared at the mathematical proof of his guilt, and his carefully engineered facade shattered entirely. During 8 grueling hours of relentless questioning, his defenses collapsed. Stripped of his theatricality, he admitted to the execution. He detailed a volatile argument earlier that night, where she explicitly threatened to leave and take their infant daughter. Faced with the prospect of public abandonment and the ultimate loss of control, he chose annihilation. The legal consequence was unyielding. The courts stripped him of his aviation rank and public standing, handing down a maximum life sentence for premeditated murder, plus 10 additional years for killing the dog and staging the violent scene. The man who demanded total control over his environment was reduced to a rigid, state-mandated prison schedule, locked inside a concrete cell where he dictated absolutely nothing. The Gleica Nera execution stands as a stark warning about the modern masks people wear. To the outside world, the aviator and his young bride represented an affluent, untouchable ideal, a perfect existence constructed through calculated curation. But behind the heavy suburban deadbolts lay a reality of absolute subjugation. Ultimately, it wasn't a seasoned detective or a street informant that broke his flawless script. The only witness to his brutality was a silent, unfeeling string of digital code, proving that even the most meticulously directed lies cannot erase the math of a stopping heart. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon. In September 2016, a 53-year-old registered nurse walked into a psychiatric hospital in Toronto, seeking help for a severe drug addiction, but the standard admission forms couldn't capture the weight of what she was about to unpack. Sitting in a stark clinical room, she casually confessed to slaughtering 8 people. There was no ongoing manhunt, no police tape. The victims were already buried, their deaths officially logged as natural causes. She wasn't a phantom breaking through windows in the dead of night. She had a key card, a uniform, and the absolute trust of every family she destroyed. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Born in the summer of 1967 in a quiet rural township, Elizabeth Parker, who would later be known by her married name, Elizabeth Wettlaufer, grew up wrapped in the suffocating embrace of a strict Baptist household. Religion was not merely a weekend practice for her family. It was the absolute lens through which the entire world was judged. Sin was tangible. Purity was demanded. For a young girl harboring a sexual orientation that completely contradicted the rigid doctrine of her parents, this environment quickly became a psychological pressure cooker. She realized early on that she was attracted to women, a fact she viewed as a damning stain on her soul. To survive the immense pressure of her upbringing, she learned the art of extreme compartmentalization. She wore the mask of the devout, obedient daughter, while a profound, toxic shame curdled just beneath the surface. Her initial attempt to purge these internal demons led her to study religious counseling. She spent years trying to pray away the fractures in her mind, attempting to guide others toward a spiritual clarity she herself could never grasp. When that failed, she sought a different kind of salvation through service, pivoting to a secular path and enrolling in a nursing program. By the mid-1990s, she had secured her credentials as a registered nurse. The title provided the perfect camouflage. Society views nurses with inherent reverence, assigning them an automatic halo of selflessness and compassion. Wettlaufer stepped right into that ready-made identity. To the outside world, and to the families of her future victims, she was Beth, the dedicated professional who frequently went above and beyond basic medical duties. She was known to sing softly to the elderly residents, often reciting the very same hymns she had learned in her childhood church. She held their hands during difficult nights and even wrote amateur poetry about the beauty of life and the peace of passing on. She projected an aura of supreme empathy, but the foundation was rotting from the inside out. The immense stress of managing geriatric wards, combined with a lifetime of repressed identity and untreated mental illness, pushed her towards severe substance abuse. Wettlaufer began self-medicating with an aggressive cocktail of alcohol and whatever prescription narcotics she could siphon from her workplaces. The theft of drugs became a grim routine. She learned exactly how to skim from the medication carts without triggering immediate audits, altering logs just enough to evade detection. Her life outside the clinic walls became a chaotic blur of failed relationships, brief stints in rehab, and spiraling depression. She was eventually diagnosed with major depressive disorder and borderline personality traits, navigating periods of intense emotional instability that left her entirely unmoored. Yet, due to systemic blind spots and chronic understaffing in the healthcare sector, she maintained her license. She moved seamlessly from facility to facility, leaving a trail of minor disciplinary infractions that were never properly aggregated or scrutinized by the governing boards. Management saw a troubled but capable nurse. No one recognized a predator hiding in plain sight. As the chemical haze thickened, the religious fanaticism of her youth began to warp into a terrifying God complex. The shame that once controlled her was replaced by a distorted sense of divine authority. She was no longer just a caretaker administering medication. Her poetry became increasingly dark, reflecting a mind obsessed with the mechanics of death. She began to view the natural deterioration of the elderly not as a medical reality to be managed, but as a spiritual canvas waiting for her direct intervention. Woodstock is a modest municipality, characterized by historic brick buildings and quiet residential streets. Coruscant Care fits seamlessly into this landscape. From the outside, it presented a reassuring facade, neatly trimmed hedges, large windows, and a paved circular driveway for visiting families. It looked like a safe harbor. Inside, the reality of long-term geriatric care was governed by strict routines and lingering sensory details. By 11 p.m., the facility transitioned into the night shift. The bustling energy of daytime activities and visiting hours evaporated. The main overhead lights were dimmed, leaving the long corridors bathed in a low, sterile fluorescence. The ambient noise shifted from daytime television broadcasts to the mechanical hum of oxygen concentrators and the erratic, distant beeping of monitors. The air always carried a faint, indelible trace of antiseptic bleach, latex rubber, and pureed institutional food. The night shift is a profoundly liminal space. For the staff, it means battling fatigue in a quiet, isolated ecosystem. For the residents, it is a time of deep vulnerability. The elderly individuals living behind those heavy, numbered doors had already surrendered their autonomy. Their independence had been stripped away by advancing dementia, shattered hips, or failing hearts. They could not walk to a kitchen if they were thirsty. They could not use a restroom without physical assistance. Their entire existence was tethered to a plastic call button clipped to their bedsheets. If a resident pressed that button, they waited in the dark. They trusted whoever walked through the door. When a nurse approached holding a small paper cup of pills or a loaded syringe, the patient did not ask questions. They complied. The power dynamic was absolute. The registered nurse on duty was the final authority, managing the locked medication carts, updating the patient charts, and handling the sudden medical emergencies that often arose before dawn. Wettlaufer thrived in this specific isolation. The night shift operated with a skeleton crew. Personal support workers were busy changing heavy linens and assisting with hygiene, leaving the registered nurse largely unsupervised. Wettlaufer held the keys to the narcotics cabinet. She had unrestricted access to the medical refrigerators. The people under her care were not mere names on a dry erase board. They were the matriarchs and patriarchs of deep-rooted families. James Silcox was 84. He was a veteran who had navigated the brutal theaters of the Second World War. He had returned home to build a sprawling family, known for his stubborn independence and a sharp, enduring sense of humor. He had survived artillery fire and decades of hard labor, only to find himself confined to a narrow mechanical bed due to rapid physical decline. He loved his children fiercely and hated the loss of his mobility. A few doors down was Maurice Grana, also 84. Maurice had been a mechanic, a man whose hands were permanently calloused from a lifetime of pulling apart engines and fixing things his neighbors had discarded as broken. His booming laugh had once filled local garages. Even as cognitive decline began to fray his memories, his essential warmth remained intact. There was Gladys Millard, an 87-year-old woman whose life had been defined by quiet devotion. She had spent decades volunteering in her local parish and cultivating immaculate rose gardens. She possessed an endless reservoir of patience, often sitting quietly by her window, watching the seasons change outside the facility glass. Helen Matheson was 95. A former Sunday school teacher, she had outlived her husband and many of her lifelong friends. Despite her advanced age and the extreme fragility of her bones, she maintained a gentle dignity, always offering a soft smile to the staff who brought her morning tea. These individuals had survived the Great Depression, global conflicts, and the agonizing loss of spouses. They had rich, textured histories, but within the walls of the care home, their identities were frequently reduced to their medical baselines: hypertension, Alzheimer's, type 2 diabetes. Wettlaufer studied these baselines. Working the overnight hours, she learned their specific vulnerabilities. She noted who slept heavily through the night and who thrashed in the grip of night terrors. She knew which families visited every single afternoon and which residents rarely received guests. More importantly, she understood the statistical reality of a geriatric ward. Death was a frequent, expected visitor at Carescent Care. When an 85-year-old resident with a history of cardiac issues quietly expires in their sleep at 3 a.m, alarms do not sound. Crime scene tape is not rolled out across the linoleum. The police are never dispatched. A doctor simply reviews the chart, signs a death certificate, and a local funeral home is discreetly called to the rear loading dock. It is the accepted, natural order of extreme old age. Wettlaufer recognized the terrible power hidden within this blind spot. The facility was engineered to provide comfort at the end of life. She realized with chilling clarity that the absolute lack of forensic scrutiny meant she could dictate exactly when that end arrived. She didn't need to smuggle a weapon into the building. The medicine carts in the hallway were already fully stocked. Insulin is a miracle of modern pharmacology. For millions, it regulates the body's energy, maintaining a delicate chemical balance. But administered in massive, uncalculated doses to a non-diabetic or an elderly patient with existing frailties, it transforms into an invisible, untraceable poison. A severe overdose triggers profound hypoglycemia. The brain is abruptly starved of glucose. The physiological response is violent and utterly terrifying. It begins with a cold, clammy sweat. Tremors rack the limbs. Severe confusion sets in as the central nervous system panics, sending frantic, misfiring emergency signals. The heart races, pounding desperately against the ribs. Vision blurs, speech slurs into incoherence. Without immediate medical intervention, the blood sugar plummets further, dragging the victim into severe, agonizing convulsions. The brain begins to shut down, coma follows, then systemic organ failure, then death. The true horror of a fatal insulin overdose in a long-term care facility is its camouflage. In an 84-year-old with a history of cardiovascular disease, hypoglycemic shock perfectly mimics a massive, unexpected heart attack or a sudden stroke. Furthermore, insulin naturally degrades in the bloodstream. By the time a coroner examines the body, the chemical weapon has vanished without a trace. Wettlaufer understood this pharmacology perfectly. She knew she possessed a weapon that left no fingerprints, no entry wounds, and no forensic anomalies. Her motive was not financial gain. She harbored no personal vendettas against the residents. The reality was far more disturbing. Wettlaufer operated under a twisted internal theology. She claimed she experienced what she called a red surge. It was a sudden, overwhelming physical sensation, a flush of heat and pressure rising in her chest, clouding her judgment and hijacking her reality. She interpreted this physiological surge as a direct divine signal, a command from God. She convinced herself that the Almighty was using her as a vessel to end the earthly suffering of the elderly. By holding a syringe, she felt she held the keys to heaven. The crushing shame and chaotic powerlessness of her own life evaporated in those moments. Standing over a helpless, bedridden patient, she was no longer a broken addict with a failing personal life. She was an angel of mercy, the ultimate arbiter of life and death. The psychological dam broke in the late summer of 2007. It was August 11th. The night shift at Carescent Care was typically quiet. The air conditioning hummed. The long, sterile corridors were empty. James Silcox rested in his room. The 84-year-old veteran was vulnerable, trusting, and entirely dependent on the staff. The red surge took hold. Wettlaufer stood at the locked medication cart. She entered the code. She opened the small, refrigerated drawer holding the insulin vials. She selected a tiny, fine-tipped syringe, the kind that barely registers as a pinch on the skin. She bypassed the standard therapeutic doses. She drew the clear liquid up to the very top of the barrel, a massive, lethal payload. She walked down the dimly lit hallway. No cameras, no witnesses, just the squeak of her rubber-soled shoes against the linoleum. She pushed open the heavy wooden door to Silcox's room. He was awake but defenseless. He knew Beth. He trusted the uniform. She approached the edge of the bed. There was no struggle, no need for physical restraint. She simply pressed the fine needle into his flesh and depressed the plunger. The clear liquid disappeared into his tissue. She withdrew the needle. She turned around. She walked out. She pulled the door shut behind her. She returned to the nursing station, poured a cup of stale coffee, and sat down under the fluorescent lights. She opened the patient charts. She waited. Down the hall, behind the closed door, the artificial insulin flooded Silcox's bloodstream. His liver stopped producing glucose. His cells forcibly absorbed whatever sugar remained in his blood. His brain began to starve. The cold sweats began, the violent tremors, the pure, unadulterated panic of a mind suffocating from the inside out. Unable to call for help, unable to reach the plastic call button clipped to his sheets, his failing body fought a desperate, losing battle in the dark. The veteran who had survived the horrors of global combat was quietly murdered by the woman paid to protect him. When he was discovered unresponsive hours later, the facility protocols engaged exactly as Vettlaufer knew they would. A physician examined the body. Given his advanced age and medical chart, the death was logged as natural causes. No autopsy was ordered. The family was notified. The room was cleared for the next resident. Vettlaufer felt a profound, sick catharsis. The pressure in her chest released. She had committed the ultimate transgression, and absolutely nothing happened. The sheer invisibility of the crime emboldened her. She played the role of the grieving caretaker flawlessly, offering condolences to the Silcox family, her uniform carrying the faint scent of institutional bleach and the very room where he died. Months later, the red surge returned. In December 2007, she targeted Maurice Granam. The 84-year-old mechanic was subjected to the exact same lethal protocol. The unprescribed draw of insulin, the quiet walk down the corridor, the injection in the dark, the agonizing hidden physiological collapse. Again, the facility recorded a natural passing. Again, the coroner's office remained entirely unnotified. The killing paused, interrupted by her own stints in rehab and spiraling mental health crises, but it inevitably resumed with terrifying efficiency. As her addiction deepened, the intervals between murders began to shrink. By the fall of 2011, the red surge was a frequent, demanding presence. On October 14th, she walked into Gladys Millard's room. The 87-year-old was injected with the same untraceable poison. 10 days later, on October 24th, 95-year-old Helen Matheson suffered the identical fate. 2 weeks after that, on November 7th, 96-year-old Mary Zurawinski became the fifth victim. Vettlaufer didn't just kill, she observed the aftermath. After administering the injections, she frequently continued her rounds, checking blood pressures and adjusting oxygen masks for other residents. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. She moved between the roles of healer and executioner with horrifying ease. Vettlaufer's methodology had calcified into a grim, practiced routine. Check the halls, draw the lethal dose, deliver the strike, retreat to the desk, falsify the charts, log the death as an expected decline. The facility's management noticed an uptick in mortality, but in a long-term care home, a cluster of winter deaths is rarely scrutinized as a statistical anomaly. It is simply written off as the fragile nature of the geriatric population. Vettlaufer hid behind this actuarial reality. She knew that the older the victim, the fewer questions asked. She weaponized the very nature of palliative care, turning the expectation of death into a perfect shield for serial murder. She sat at the nexus of life and death, entirely unsupervised, playing God in the quietest hours of the night. By 2013, the rigid compartmentalization Vettlaufer relied upon to separate her daytime persona from her nighttime atrocities began to violently fracture. The stolen narcotics she siphoned from the locked cabinets were no longer sufficient to numb the psychological weight of her actions. Her physical appearance deteriorated. Coworkers noticed her bloodshot eyes, her erratic mood swings, and the slight tremor in her hands as she sorted pills into small paper cups. Yet, within the high-stress, chronically understaffed environment of long-term care, these warning signs were routinely dismissed as extreme burnout. The system was designed to protect its own, and the nurses' union provided a formidable shield against administrative scrutiny. As her personal life spiraled further into addiction, the frequency of the red surge intensified. It was no longer an occasional, twisted interpretation of divine will. It had become a dark compulsion. In late 2013, she targeted Wayne Hedges. The 84-year-old had suffered a severe stroke, but retained a sharp, observant wit. He was injected in the dark and passed away shortly after. In early 2014, 79-year-old Maureen Pickering, a woman quietly battling the encroaching fog of dementia, suffered the exact same fate. The social echo within Carasant Care began to manifest as a quiet, pervasive dread. In the stark fluorescent light of the staff break room, nurses and support workers exchanged uneasy glances. Whispers circulated about the unusually high mortality rate on Wetlaufer's shifts. A grim gallows humor emerged among the night crew, quietly noting that a disproportionate number of body bags seemed to be rolled out the back loading dock before dawn. But the leap from suspecting poor nursing care to alleging active serial murder is a psychological chasm that most professional colleagues simply cannot cross. Without obvious trauma, without bruised necks or defensive wounds, the deaths were consistently attributed to a harsh winter flu season or the fragile inevitability of geriatric decline. Emboldened by this absolute systemic blindness, Wetlaufer grew increasingly reckless. She no longer limited herself to those she deemed ready for death. She began experimenting with her lethal dosages, resulting in a terrifying string of near misses. She administered massive amounts of insulin to residents like Clotilde Adriano and her sister, Albina de Medeiros. They did not die, but their fragile systems were plunged into severe hypoglycemic shock, leaving them with permanent, agonizing cognitive and physical damage. When the morning staff found these women seizing and unresponsive, emergency protocols were initiated. Ambulances were called. Blood sugars were stabilized at the local hospital. Yet, even as attending physicians noted the completely inexplicable spikes in insulin levels in non-diabetic patients, the dots remained unconnected. The facility simply assumed there had been a charting error. The sheer administrative inertia finally cracked in the spring of 2014, but not for the right reasons. Management at Carasant Care fired Wetlaufer, not because they suspected her of ending lives, but because of repeated documented medication errors. She was caught incorrectly logging the administration of narcotics and, incredibly, insulin. The very weapon she used to execute 7 people was flagged in an HR file merely as an issue of professional incompetence. The termination should have triggered an immediate, exhaustive police audit. It did not. Instead, a monumental systemic failure occurred. Wetlaufer was handed a severance package. The College of Nurses of Ontario received a mandatory report detailing her firing, but her nursing license was never suspended. The bureaucratic machinery ground to a halt, allowing a prolific serial killer to seamlessly transfer her credentials to a new hunting ground. Within weeks, she secured employment at Meadow Park, another care facility located miles away in London, Ontario. The change of scenery did nothing to silence the compulsion. In August 2014, she stood over the bed of Arpad Horvath, a 75-year-old resident with a history of dementia. The familiar cycle repeated: the drawn syringe, the quiet corridor, the fatal injection. Horvath became her 8th and final murder victim. But the psychological architecture of her God complex was finally collapsing. The divine justification she had constructed to rationalize the slaughter could no longer hold the sheer volume of her guilt. The ghosts of 8 people crowded her deteriorating mind. Desperate to relieve the pressure, she began confessing to those around her. She detailed her crimes to a former romantic partner. She sat in a church pew and confessed everything to her pastor. She even casually mentioned her lethal actions to a lawyer over an unrelated matter. The response she received was the ultimate bitter irony. Because of her known history of severe substance abuse and borderline personality traits, everyone assumed she was experiencing drug-induced psychosis. They believed she was simply an addict desperate for attention, spinning morbid fantasies to shock them. She was screaming her guilt into the void, and society, conditioned to believe that healthcare workers save lives rather than take them, refused to listen. The killer was begging to be stopped, but the shadows she had operated in for 7 years were simply too deep to pierce. The tipping point arrived in September 2016. Elizabeth Wetlaufer finally sought help, checking herself into the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto. The facility was designed to treat severe psychiatric breaks and chemical dependencies, handling patients at their absolute lowest. Sitting in a quiet, sterile room, she handed a multi-page handwritten document to the psychiatric staff. It was not a journal of her recovery. It was a highly organized ledger of death. It listed specific names, exact dates, and the precise dosages of medication she had used to execute them. The medical staff could not brush this off as the morbid hallucination of a severe addict. The details were far too clinical. They contacted the Toronto police. The file was immediately routed to the Woodstock Police Service, where the assigned detectives were handed a procedural nightmare. The fundamental architecture of a homicide investigation had been entirely inverted. Normally, police begin with a physical crime scene, a body, a weapon, a forensic footprint, and work outward to identify a suspect. Here, they had a suspect sitting quietly in a chair, practically begging to be locked up, but absolutely no crime scenes. The rooms at Coruscant Care had been sterilized and reassigned years ago. The victims had been embalmed, buried, or cremated. Every single death had been legally certified by an attending physician as the natural consequence of advanced age. The initial police hypothesis leaned heavily towards psychological delusion. It is a documented phenomenon for individuals suffering from severe mental illness or substance withdrawal to confess to phantom crimes, seeking attention or punishment for an internalized sense of guilt. The detectives assumed they were dealing with a psychiatric break until they executed the first round of search warrants. Investigators descended on the administrative offices of Coruscant Care and Meadow Park. They seized hundreds of thousands of pages of institutional data. The detectives needed staffing rotas, payroll timesheets, pharmacy inventory logs, and the heavy binders containing the patient's daily medical charts spanning back to 2007. It was a grueling, mind-numbing paper chase. They set up incident rooms, covering the walls with timelines, attempting to reconstruct the mundane overnight operations of a geriatric ward from years past. The civilian analysts began overlaying Wetlaufer's time cards with the facility death registries. As the data merged, the delusion theory evaporated. A flawless, inescapable pattern emerged on the spreadsheets. Every single name on her handwritten confession perfectly aligned with her overnight shifts. Furthermore, the timing of the physiological collapses matched the exact administration windows she had documented. Every unexpected cardiac arrest, every sudden hypoglycemic crash happened when she held the keys to the locked medication carts. She was telling the absolute truth. Proving it in a court of law, however, presented a massive forensic hurdle. Insulin is the perfect ghost weapon. It is a naturally occurring hormone that degrades rapidly in human tissue post-mortem. Exhuming the bodies of the deceased victims would yield no chemical smoking gun. The soft tissues had long since decomposed, and standard post-mortem toxicology screens cannot detect an artificial hypoglycemic crash years after the fact. To build an airtight legal case, the investigators pivoted their focus to the near misses. Detectives meticulously combed through the files of the residents Wetlaufer claimed to have injected, but who had ultimately survived. When they reviewed the emergency hospital admission records for these specific individuals, the archived blood work told a damning story. The laboratory results from the exact nights they were rushed to the emergency room showed catastrophic, entirely unexplainable drops in blood sugar. Crucially, the diagnostic panels revealed extreme levels of synthetic insulin in patients who had absolutely no history of diabetes. The biochemical footprint was undeniable. On October 5th, 2016, investigators brought her into a formal interrogation room. The environment was sparse. Just a heavy table, 2 chairs, and the steady hum of the recording equipment. Detectives braced themselves for the standard behavior of a cornered suspect: denial, extreme minimization, or an immediate demand for legal counsel. Instead, she waived her right to silence. She sat perfectly still and recounted the murders with the detached clinical efficiency of a nurse giving a routine shift handover. She described the overwhelming physical sensation of the red surge. She explained how she unlocked the cart, drew the clear liquid into the fine-tipped syringes, and selected the injection sites. She detailed watching the patients slip into irreversible comas, her voice never wavering. She even raised her hand, mimicking the motion of pressing the plunger with her thumb. For the seasoned detectives across the table, the interview was profoundly disturbing. They were not looking at a calculated cartel enforcer or a violent predator. They were watching a mild-mannered, middle-aged healthcare worker in a sweater calmly dismantle the foundational trust of the entire medical system. Then came the most agonizing phase of the investigation. The detectives had to notify the families. Officers sat at their desks, making phone calls to people who had buried their parents and grandparents nearly a decade prior. They had to systematically inform grieving children that the peaceful, natural passing they had accepted was a complete fabrication. The social echo was immediate and devastating. The quiet community of Woodstock was completely fractured. Families who currently had loved ones in long-term care panicked, pulling their relatives out of facilities or demanding immediate, retroactive reviews of their medical charts. The localized fear morphed into a national outrage. The realization that a prolific serial killer had used an underfunded, overlooked geriatric system as a personal hunting ground for 7 years shattered the public's illusion of safety. The healthcare system, designed to protect the most vulnerable, had provided the perfect camouflage for an apex predator. On October 25, 2016, Elizabeth Wettlaufer was formally charged. The scope of the indictment was staggering: 8 counts of first-degree murder, 4 counts of attempted murder, and 2 counts of aggravated assault. The prosecution completely avoided a grueling, circumstantial trial because the forensic paper trail, built outward from her own meticulous confession, was legally insurmountable. In June 2017, she walked into a packed courtroom. No defense was mounted. No claims of temporary insanity were presented to the bench. She simply pleaded guilty to every single charge. The victims' families sat quietly in the gallery, forced to look at the woman who had stolen their loved ones' final days. The judge handed down 8 concurrent life sentences. She would never breathe free air again, but the heavy sound of the gavel falling offered no true closure. The legal resolution could not repair the catastrophic damage inflicted on the geriatric care sector. The fundamental social contract, the implicit belief that the most fragile among us are safe in the hands of medical professionals, was irrevocably broken. A massive public inquiry was quickly launched to dissect the profound bureaucratic failures that allowed an active serial killer to float between facilities for nearly a decade, unchecked, unquestioned, and entirely unseen. Elizabeth Wettlaufer fundamentally shattered our most desperate assumption that the vulnerable are safe in the hands of the sworn healer. We naturally fear the violent stranger, the shattered lock, the sudden chaos in the dark. But the Woodstock murders proved a much colder reality. The ultimate predator isn't always hiding in the shadows. Sometimes they wear a pressed uniform. They hold your hand. The most dangerous monsters don't break down your door. They simply tuck you in. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon. A highly respected Atlanta attorney known for commanding courtrooms did not meet his end peacefully. Gary Ferris was found on his sprawling 10-acre estate, reduced to ash and bone fragments in a smoldering backyard burn pile. The jarring contrast between his immense wealth and his primitive disposal is staggering. Sifted from the blackened debris was a single, deformed .38 caliber bullet, lodged deep within a charred rib. A man who built an empire, literally burned to the ground. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Drive north from the dense, concrete sprawl of downtown Atlanta, and the landscape gradually shifts. The highways give way to winding 2-lane blacktops, thick canopies of pine trees, and the oppressive humidity of Cherokee County, Georgia. It is a region where generational wealth often hides behind heavy iron gates and long gravel driveways. At the end of Purcell Lane sat a sweeping 10-acre estate. It was a property that demanded relentless upkeep, a sprawling mix of pastures, outbuildings, and dense woods that offered absolute privacy. To the outside world, this farm was a picture of southern prosperity. To the people living on it, the isolation was absolute. The mechanical hum of the city was replaced by the deafening drone of summer cicadas, the smell of damp red clay, and the heavy stillness of the rural south. This estate belonged to 58-year-old Gary Ferris. He was a man who navigated two entirely different realities. By day, he was a powerhouse in the Atlanta legal community. As a highly successful commercial real estate attorney and a prominent partner at a top-tier firm, his intellect and work ethic were legendary. Colleagues noted his sharp mind, his ability to dissect complex contracts, and a demeanor that commanded respect in any boardroom. He was an imposing physical figure, weighing well over 300 pounds. Yet he was known for a pragmatic, even-keeled approach to problem-solving. He spent his days in tailored suits, navigating high-stakes negotiations in air-conditioned glass towers. He was the primary breadwinner, carrying the immense financial weight of his family's lifestyle on his shoulders without complaint. Gary was deeply dedicated to his practice, working grueling 60-hour weeks to ensure his 4 children had every advantage. Waiting for him at the end of that commute was his wife of nearly 4 decades, 64-year-old Melody Walker Ferris. She managed the day-to-day operations of the farm, tending to the livestock and the acreage. While Gary thrived in the fast-paced, structured environment of corporate law, Melody was entrenched in the dirt and routine of rural life. The couple had raised their family on this land, but as the kids grew older and the main house emptied out, the 10 acres began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a secluded compound. Gary's daily routine was punishing. He commuted over 30 miles each way through dense traffic, leaving the farm before the sun crested the tree line and returning long after dark. When he finally pulled his vehicles up the driveway, he traded his briefcase for work boots. Despite his demanding career, he never shied away from the physical labor required to maintain a working property. He could often be found on a heavy tractor on the weekends, clearing brush, repairing miles of fencing, or managing the estate's designated burn pile, a deep pit located about 100 yards from the main residence, used for disposing of fallen branches. He poured his earnings into the land, envisioning the farm as a quiet legacy for his family. But physical space does not equal emotional closeness. The sheer size of the Purcell Lane estate meant 2 people could exist on the same property for days without crossing paths. There were multiple structures, a massive primary residence, a large barn with a fully equipped apartment above it, and various sheds scattered across the terrain. This geographical distance perfectly mirrored a growing chasm between the husband and wife. The silence of the property, once its greatest selling point, became a suffocating presence. While Gary focused entirely on building a financial empire, the foundation of his home life was fracturing. He paid the bills, managed the accounts, and kept the expensive machinery of their lives running smoothly. Completely unaware that the vast isolation he worked so hard to finance was creating the perfect, unmonitored environment for his own destruction. 38 years is an eternity to share with one person. When a marriage spans almost 4 decades, the roots grow incredibly deep, but they can also become choked by resentment, transforming a shared foundation into a slow-moving prison. In the early days, the union was built on traditional lines, a mutual vision of stability, family, and carving out a secure piece of the world. But as the years bled together, the partnership devolved into a bitter, transactional coexistence. The Cherokee County farm stopped being a sanctuary. It morphed into a heavily contested battleground where the primary weapons were weaponized silence, financial leverage, and psychological warfare. Money was the central bleeding artery of their conflict. The attorney generated the entirety of the wealth, pulling in a substantial income from his relentless corporate grind. Naturally, he controlled the flow of that capital. To him, the funds were strictly allocated for maintaining the estate, supporting their adult children, and securing a tangible legacy in the soil. To his wife, the wealth was a tool for personal autonomy, a freedom she felt was severely and unfairly restricted. Her response to this perceived control was reckless, retaliatory spending. She opened multiple covert credit card accounts, rapidly racking up massive debts without his knowledge or consent. Packages would arrive continuously at the rural mailbox, filled with frivolous purchases she used to plug an emotional void. When the sprawling credit card statements inevitably surfaced, the resulting confrontations were explosive. The husband would demand accountability for the tens of thousands of dollars evaporating into thin air, his patience fraying under the financial strain. She would fiercely counter by insisting she was owed heavy compensation for decades of managing the massive property and raising their family. He threatened to completely sever her access to their joint checking accounts. She demanded an equal, unrestricted share of the empire he had spent his life building. The atmosphere inside the primary residence turned venomous. The couple abandoned any pretense of intimacy, sleeping in entirely separate wings of the large house. They navigated around each other like hostile inmates trapped in the same cell block. Family members noted the palpable, heavy tension whenever both were forced into the same room, the air instantly thickening with unspoken animosity. Through indirect accounts from their adult children, the grim reality of their daily lives was dragged into the light. The father would often express deep, bone-weary exhaustion, stating that he simply wanted a few hours of peace after grinding through brutal work weeks. The mother, conversely, complained bitterly to anyone who would listen about feeling trapped, isolated, and financially suffocated by a man she could no longer stand to look at. She frequently voiced her outright disdain, telling acquaintances that she despised his very presence and actively wished he would simply disappear. The resentment had calcified into pure, unadulterated hatred. Seeking a reprieve from the suffocating environment she helped create, the wife sought validation far beyond the fence line. She stepped way outside the boundaries of the marriage, engaging in secret, prolonged romantic relationships. This wasn't a fleeting moment of indiscretion. It was a calculated, sustained pattern of betrayal. She cultivated a hidden digital life, sending highly intimate text messages and arranging clandestine meetups away from the prying eyes of their tight-knit rural community. These affairs provided her with the intoxicating attention and control she felt utterly deprived of at home. In her mind, the infidelity was entirely justified, a necessary, righteous rebellion against a husband she viewed as an oppressive financial warden. The men she pursued stood in stark contrast to the disciplined, highly educated corporate lawyer she had married. They offered a reckless, chaotic escape from the rigid, crushing structure of her daily existence. But maintaining this double life required a tremendous amount of deceptive energy, adding another layer of volatile paranoia to a household already pushed to the brink. By the late spring of 2018, the marriage had reached terminal velocity. The attorney was actively, quietly, consulting with his legal colleagues about the grueling logistics of a divorce. He told close associates that his threshold had been breached, that he could no longer tolerate the relentless financial hemorrhaging and the toxic hostility waiting for him at the end of every long commute. But dismantling a union of that length is a complex, agonizing process. He hesitated. He knew that a legal separation would mean liquidating the sprawling farm he had worked his entire life to build, paying exorbitant alimony, and watching his hard-earned assets be ruthlessly split down the middle by the courts. For the wife, the prospect of divorce presented a terrifying, unacceptable reality. A legal dissolution meant losing her lavish, insulated lifestyle overnight. She would be forced off the sprawling property, permanently stripped of her social standing, and left with a mere fraction of the wealth she felt entitled to. The financial arithmetic in her mind was brutal and absolute. Remaining legally bound to a man she despised was intolerable, but divorcing him meant total financial ruin. The trap had closed tight. As the heavy, suffocating Georgia heat set in that summer, the tension was building toward an inevitable breaking point. The secluded estate was rapidly transforming from a fractured home into the staging ground for a permanent, violent solution. Early July in Cherokee County brings a specific kind of atmospheric misery. The humidity clings to the skin like a wet canvas, thick and unyielding. The air is entirely stagnant, smelling of hot asphalt and damp red clay. In 2018, as the 4th of July holiday approached, the Purcell Lane estate was locked in this oppressive weather pattern. Distant fireworks occasionally echoed through the pine trees, a low rhythmic booming that provided the perfect auditory cover for the violence about to unfold. The prominent attorney was taking a rare break from his corporate firm, spending the holiday week at the farm. His wife was also home. They were completely isolated on the 10-acre property, cut off from the eyes of their colleagues, friends, and neighbors. The vast space that was meant to be a refuge had become a locked pressure cooker, and the structural integrity of their toxic marriage was finally giving way. The primary residence featured a sprawling, unfinished basement. It was a functional space, holding tools, seasonal storage, and hunting equipment. Built into the sloping earth, the lower level was naturally cool, surrounded by thick concrete foundation walls that deadened sound. It was the husband's domain, a place where he stored his gear and managed the mechanical upkeep of the farm. Sometime during the early days of July, the simmering hostility between the couple migrated down the wooden stairs into this subterranean space. The exact catalyst for the final confrontation remains buried in the ashes, but the psychological groundwork had been laid over years of financial bleeding and deep-seated hatred, a demand for accountability, a definitive threat to dissolve the marriage and liquidate the assets, a final, absolute refusal to continue funding an extravagant, deceptive lifestyle. The verbal dispute escalated rapidly in the dim light of the basement. The tension, stretched to its absolute limit over 38 years, finally snapped. No screaming, no prolonged physical struggle, just a sudden, violent finality. A .38 caliber handgun was leveled. The trigger was pulled. The sharp, deafening crack of the gunshot violently breached the heavy silence of the concrete room. A single piece of lead tore through tissue and bone, striking the attorney square in the chest. The massive kinetic energy of the impact halted him instantly. Over 300 pounds of dead weight collapsed heavily onto the hard floor. The bullet drove deep into his torso, ultimately shattering and lodging firmly inside a rib bone. He bled out rapidly on the cold concrete. In a matter of seconds, a man who commanded boardrooms and built a financial empire was reduced to a lifeless obstacle on his own basement floor. Silence returned to the subterranean room, leaving behind the sharp, metallic odor of gunpowder and rapidly pooling blood. But the execution was only the beginning of the nightmare. The immediate, terrifying reality of physics set in. Moving a human body of that immense size is an extreme mechanical challenge. A woman in her 60s cannot simply lift or carry a man of that stature. The disposal required cold calculation, mechanical leverage, and sheer, grueling physical exertion. A large, heavy tarp or piece of thick canvas was unrolled onto the concrete. The remains had to be rolled and wrestled onto the material. The friction of dragging that much dead weight across a rough floor required immense effort. During this desperate struggle, the cleanup was compromised. As the heavy package was maneuvered toward the lower-level walkout doors, wet smears of blood transferred onto the surrounding surfaces. Deep red stains seeped into the wooden trim at the base of the basement stairs, microscopic markers of a desperate struggle against gravity. The heavy exterior door was shoved open. The blistering July heat rushed into the cool basement. The package was dragged out into the dirt, leaving a wide, unnatural furrow in the dust. A piece of heavy farm machinery, a tractor or utility vehicle, was backed directly up to the exit. Using a combination of makeshift ramps, leverage, and raw desperation, the tarp was hoisted into the cargo bed. The engine turned over, breaking the rural silence. The destination was exactly 100 yards away from the main house. Over the years, the property owner had built and maintained a designated burn pit on the edge of the tree line. It was a massive, deep depression in the earth, heavily loaded with dry brush, fallen oak branches, and discarded household debris. He had spent countless weekend hours clearing his land and throwing the refuse into this very pit. It was a routine, practical element of farm management. Now, the pit he built was repurposed as his own makeshift crematorium. The vehicle backed up to the edge of the depression. The tarp was pulled. The heavy remains tumbled down into the tangled web of dry wood and debris. Liquid accelerant was poured aggressively over the wood, the canvas, and the body. The sharp chemical fumes of gasoline warped the humid air. A flame was introduced to the edge of the pit. The ignition was instantaneous and violent. A massive column of orange fire and black smoke roared upward, consuming the oxygen and radiating blistering heat. But destroying a human body in an open-air environment is not a rapid process. It is a grueling, time-consuming endeavor. Cremation requires sustained thermal temperatures exceeding 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The initial blaze, fueled by gasoline, would burn out too quickly to reduce bone to ash. The fire had to be actively, meticulously managed. This required an unimaginable level of psychological detachment. For hours and bleeding into days, the perpetrator had to stand near the roaring heat of the July fire, breathing in the oily, dense smoke of burning tissue. The fire demanded constant labor. More heavy wood had to be chopped and hauled to the pit. The embers had to be continually stoked with long iron tools to maintain the critical thermal threshold. The killer had to repeatedly approach the lip of the inferno, staring down into the flames to ensure the destruction was absolute, feeding the pyre every time the heat began to drop. It was the grueling, sweaty, horrific physical labor of murder. Over the holiday week, a thick, persistent plume of gray smoke rolled continuously across the 10-acre property. The wind carried it over the fence lines and out toward the main road. The smell was heavy and acrid. Neighbors driving past noted the smoke rising above the tree line. Yet this was rural Georgia. Tending a brush fire in the summer, especially around the 4th of July, was an entirely normal, benign activity. No alarms were raised. No one dialed 911. The surrounding community simply assumed the family was catching up on routine yard work. While the fire raged outside, the interior cover-up commenced. The basement was scrubbed with harsh industrial chemicals. Mops pushed bleach-heavy water across the concrete floor, desperately trying to erase the metallic scent and the biological markers of the execution. The area was reorganized to look undisturbed, but the frantic, exhausted scrubbing missed the faint, rusted discoloration on the stair trim. The trap had been sprung, the body destroyed, and the evidence seemingly turned to vapor. The farm fell back into a deceptive, terrifying quiet. The corporate machine operates on rigid, unforgiving schedules. By the time the post-holiday work week resumed, the silence emanating from the Ferris household was deafening. The attorney was a man who lived and died by his calendar, a professional who answered complex legal emails before dawn, and never, under any circumstances, missed a scheduled conference call. But when his downtown Atlanta firm opened its doors, his corner office remained dark and empty. High-priority calls from junior partners and anxious clients went straight to voicemail, greeted only by his automated, recorded voice. The digital infrastructure of his heavily managed life simply stalled out. This was not a man prone to spontaneous retreats or unannounced sabbaticals. His colleagues immediately recognized a fundamental breach in his pattern. The gears of his career had stopped turning, and the alarm bells began to ring. Simultaneously, a deep, creeping anxiety began to ripple through the family network. The adult children had not heard from their father in days, a stark deviation from his usual constant communication. When they reached out to their mother at the farm, the responses they received were evasive, disjointed, and bizarrely casual. She suggested he might be out walking the vast property, tending to routine farm chores, or perhaps taking a quiet moment for himself. But the 10-acre estate on Purcell Lane was not a dense wilderness. If he was there, he would be visible or reachable. The sheer isolation of the Cherokee County farm, originally purchased as a buffer against the chaotic outside world, now felt like a sprawling, impenetrable fortress hiding a terrible reality. Driven by a mounting sense of visceral dread, one of their adult sons made the definitive decision to physically travel to the estate to locate his father. The drive up the long, winding gravel path was accompanied only by the heavy drone of summer cicadas and the crunch of tires on stone. When he parked near the main residence, the atmosphere was uniquely, heavily unsettled. His mother emerged, but she did not share his frantic, escalating urgency. Her demeanor was inexplicably flat, a chilling contrast to a wife whose husband of nearly 40 years had vanished without a trace. Unsatisfied with her vague explanations and lack of concern, the son pivoted away from the house and began a systematic physical search of the acreage himself. The mid-July heat was suffocating, pressing down on the pastures like a wet blanket. As he navigated past the large barn and the various storage sheds, a distinct, acrid scent caught his attention in the stagnant air. It wasn't the clean, familiar smell of a standard agricultural brush fire. It was dense, oily, and clung to the back of the throat. He followed the invisible trail of the scent, walking past the manicured lawns, down the slight slope, and moving steadily toward the heavy, shaded tree line at the edge of the property. The designated burn pit came into view. It was an enormous depression in the earth, and it was still actively smoking. A deep bed of white and gray ash filled the crater, with waves of extreme heat shimmering in the humid air above it. The son approached the lip of the pit, his boots slipping slightly on the dry soil. He peered down into the smoldering, blackened debris, scanning for any sign of his missing father. He noticed irregular shapes mixed amidst the charred oak branches and melted household refuse. They were not wood, they were structural, porous, a fragment of bone, a partial skull cap. The realization was immediate, total, and physically paralyzing. The ashes in the pit belonged to a human being. The massive pile of debris had been utilized to consume a body. High tension, short breaths, the immediate reach for a cell phone. He contacted Cherokee County Emergency Dispatch without hesitation. He reported finding human remains in the family's backyard fire pit, his voice tight, conveying the sheer, unadulterated trauma of the gruesome discovery. While he stood near the blistering heat, waiting for law enforcement to arrive, his mother remained inside the house, inexplicably detached from the nightmare, unfolding just 100 yards from her back porch. Sirens soon shattered the deep rural quiet. Multiple patrol vehicles kicked up thick clouds of red dust as they tore down Purcell Lane, lights flashing against the green canopy. First responders aggressively taped off the perimeter, establishing a wide exclusion zone around the smoldering depression. The scene they encountered was catastrophic. The environment was completely compromised by extreme thermal damage. The fire had been so intense and evidently sustained for such a prolonged period that recovering intact biological evidence seemed mathematically impossible. The initial assessment formulated by the arriving deputies heavily favored a tragic, albeit horrifying, farm accident. The victim was a heavy man, weighing well over 300 pounds, and possessed a documented history of cardiovascular issues. He frequently worked the property completely alone, utilizing heavy machinery and managing that exact fire pit on a regular basis. The working theory established on the spot was that the attorney had been out laboring in the brutal, unforgiving July heat, suffered a sudden and massive cardiac event, and accidentally tumbled forward into the active, roaring flames. It was a clean, logical explanation for an incredibly chaotic scene. A grim medical emergency, a terrible accident, not a calculated, cold-blooded homicide. As specialized crime scene technicians and the coroner's unit arrived to begin the grueling, archaeological process of sifting through the hot ash, the social echo of the event began to rapidly reverberate through the surrounding county. The local community was entirely stunned. The juxtaposition was simply too sharp for the mind to easily process. A highly educated, immaculately dressed corporate lawyer dying a primitive, fiery death in a backyard pit became the sole topic of hushed conversation in diners, hardware stores, and country clubs across the region. Neighbors suddenly recalled the thick, gray smoke they had seen lingering over the Ferris tree line for days, a cold realization washing over them as they understood what had actually been fueling the flames. The isolation of the farm had finally been breached by flashing lights and yellow tape, but the sprawling property had already swallowed its master. The initial hypothesis of a tragic medical event collapsed entirely within 72 hours. The local medical examiner's office, working in conjunction with state crime lab technicians, undertook the agonizing process of sifting through the recovered debris. Thermal destruction of that magnitude is severe, but human bone is highly resilient. During a microscopic examination of the charred remains, forensic anthropologists isolated a distinct anomaly embedded deep within a fragment of rib bone. It was not organic material. It was a severely deformed piece of lead, a spent .38 caliber bullet. The trajectory of the case pivoted instantly. A man suffering a massive heart attack does not somehow shoot himself in the chest before falling into a fire. The accidental death theory was completely discarded. The Cherokee County Sheriff's Office was now navigating a complex, calculated homicide investigation. Armed with the confirmation of a gunshot wound, detectives immediately returned to the Purcell Lane estate with sweeping search warrants. The property was no longer a grieving family's sanctuary. It was an active crime scene. Investigators systematically moved through the main residence, focusing their attention on the lower level, where the victim spent the majority of his time. To the naked eye, the basement appeared orderly. The concrete floor smelled faintly of industrial bleach and cleaning solvents. But chemical concealment is rarely absolute. Forensic technicians darkened the subterranean room and applied luminol. The reaction was immediate and undeniable. A brilliant blue luminescence illuminated the concrete, revealing the faint but unmistakable pattern of a massive blood pool near the workbench. The glowing trail did not end there. It extended across the floor, documenting a wide, heavy drag path that moved directly toward the exterior walkout doors. Further inspection of the wooden trim at the base of the stairs yielded physical swabs of biological material that had soaked deep into the grain, subsequently matched to the attorney's DNA. The execution site was officially confirmed. The focus shifted heavily to the remaining inhabitants of the farm. When investigators sat down with the widow, they expected to encounter a woman shattered by the confirmation that her husband had been violently murdered. Instead, her demeanor remained unnervingly flat. Her emotional register was entirely vacant. She offered no viable theories, expressed no outrage, and provided only clipped, evasive answers regarding her movements during the holiday week. But when pressed by seasoned detectives, she finally offered a definitive direction for their inquiry. She did not point outward toward an unknown intruder or a disgruntled former client from his corporate firm. She pointed the finger directly at her own blood. She suggested investigators look closely at their adult son. This revelation sent the investigation careening down a massive, highly frustrating red herring. The son resided on the exact same 10-acre property, occupying the apartment located directly above the main barn. The physical proximity alone made him a highly viable suspect. Furthermore, detectives quickly learned that the relationship between the father and son was heavily strained, marked by frequent, intense arguments over property management and personal conduct. The most damning piece of circumstantial evidence was immediately uncovered during a background check. The son legally owned a .38 caliber handgun. A search of his barn apartment yielded a box of ammunition that perfectly matched the grain and caliber of the deformed bullet extracted from the burn pit. The detectives hit a solid wall of confirmation bias. The narrative seemed neatly wrapped: a volatile son, absolute physical access, extreme proximity to the disposal site, and matching ballistic evidence. Weeks were consumed as investigators aggressively pursued this angle, subpoenaing the son's financial records, meticulously analyzing his movements, and attempting to break his alibi. The local community, feeding on the rapid spread of rumors, began to whisper about a violent generational dispute. The tension within the county amplified, fueled by the horrific idea of a son executing his own father and burning the remains in the backyard. But the timeline refused to solidify. The son's alibi held up under intense, repeated scrutiny, and his emotional reaction to his father's brutal death was raw and authentic, starkly contrasting the cold detachment displayed by his mother. Detectives found themselves bogged down in family drama, spinning their wheels while the true architect of the crime sat quietly in the main house. Frustrated by the stalled momentum and the lingering inconsistencies, the lead investigators executed a strategic pivot. They stopped looking at the physical terrain of the farm and shifted their focus entirely to the digital terrain of the widow's life. Comprehensive warrants were drafted for her cell phone records, bank statements, and credit histories. The digital footprint completely shattered her carefully constructed facade. Financial analysts uncovered a massive web of hidden debt. The widow had secretly accumulated tens of thousands of dollars in credit card liabilities, a severe financial burden that was entirely concealed from her husband until shortly before his death. The motive for murder rapidly materialized. A pending divorce would have exposed the extensive fraud, severed her access to his corporate income, and forced the total liquidation of the estate. But the financial ruin was only a fraction of the digital evidence. The data extraction from her cellular device revealed a sprawling, highly active secret life. Detectives documented sustained, intimate communications with multiple paramours, men she had been meeting covertly for months. The image of a dedicated, hard-working farm wife dissolved entirely, replaced by a portrait of a woman deeply entrenched in deception. The decisive breakthrough, the smoking gun that definitively cleared the son and placed the crosshairs squarely on the matriarch, was found buried within thousands of deleted text messages. Forensic specialists recovered a specific exchange sent from the widow's phone to one of her romantic partners just weeks before the execution in the basement. The message was devoid of any ambiguity. She explicitly detailed her deep, venomous hatred for her husband. She complained bitterly about his financial control and his mere physical presence. And then, utilizing stark, violent language, she stated that she actively wished he would die, noting precisely how much easier her life would be if he were simply erased from existence. The frustration that had plagued the detective bureau evaporated in an instant. The red herring involving the son was recognized for exactly what it was: a calculated, ruthless tactical deflection by a mother willing to sacrifice her own child to maintain her freedom and her wealth. The physical evidence of the bleach cleanup, the extreme proximity of the fire pit, the crushing financial motive, and the documented malice all converged into a single, undeniable point of failure. Arrest warrants were rapidly drafted. Cherokee County Sheriff's deputies returned to the Purcell Lane estate one final time, navigating the long gravel driveway not to search for clues, but to place handcuffs on the woman who had literally burned her marriage to the ground. In late 2024, the architect of the Ferris execution finally faced a Cherokee County jury. The sprawling acreage was traded for a sterile, fluorescent-lit courtroom. Over the course of an intense 18-day trial, the prosecution systematically laid out a mountain of digital and forensic evidence. They presented a stark portrait of a woman who chose murder over a messy divorce, unwilling to relinquish her grip on a fortune she felt entitled to. The defense mounted a desperate counteroffensive. They attempted to revive the narrative of severe family dysfunction, once again casting shadows toward the adult son. But the jury saw directly through the deflection. The physical proof, the blood markers on the basement concrete, the deformed bullet extracted from the pit, and those deeply damning text messages was insurmountable. Deliberation was swift and absolute. The jury returned a definitive verdict, guilty on all charges, including malice murder and concealing a death. The presiding judge handed down the maximum penalty, life in prison, plus an additional consecutive 5 years. The woman who ruled her rural compound with deceptive silence was quietly escorted out in handcuffs, permanently exiled to a cinder block cell entirely stripped of the wealth she killed to protect. The gated acreage in Cherokee County is quiet once again, but the heavy silence that blankets the property is no longer a symbol of peace. It is the echo of total, irreversible ruin. A sprawling farm, originally purchased to build a lasting legacy, ultimately served as a slaughterhouse and a makeshift crematorium. A brilliant mind was reduced to fragments of bone, all to satisfy a horrific, calculated greed. The land endures, but a family was completely incinerated from the inside out. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon. A knock at the door on a bright Florida morning. Standing on the porch is a clown, neon orange wig, a wide painted smile, a red bulbous nose. In one hand, a bouquet of carnations. In the other, 2 foil balloons. One bears a cheerful message praising the recipient. The homeowner remarks how pretty the flowers are and reaches out. The clown raises a gun and fires a bullet directly into her face. The balloons drift upward as the painted killer walks calmly back to a getaway car. This wasn't a child's nightmare. It was a cold-blooded execution. Please support the channel by subscribing and liking this video. Thank you so much. Wellington, Florida, in the late 1980s, was a sanctuary built for the affluent. Situated deep in Palm Beach County, it was an enclave defined by manicured equestrian estates, private airstrips, and heavy bank accounts. The humid air smelled of freshly laid asphalt and cut Bermuda grass. It was the kind of place where wrought iron gates kept the outside world at bay, creating an illusion of absolute security. In the exclusive Aero Club neighborhood, where wide driveways doubled as taxiways for personal aircraft, lived 40-year-old Marlene Warren. Her life appeared to be a flawless reflection of the American dream. She resided in a sprawling, multi-level home encompassing over 4,000 square feet, situated on a lush 2-acre lot. But the pristine, sun-drenched facade of her property concealed the heavy toll of a fractured marriage. Marlene was not a product of generational wealth, nor did she adopt the pretentious airs of her neighbors. She was an inherently grounded woman who preferred the quiet satisfaction of landscaping in the oppressive 90-degree Florida heat over attending high society galas. Friends remembered her as generous and fiercely protective of her 2 teenage sons from a previous marriage, John and Joseph. Despite the vast expanse of marble and imported fixtures surrounding her, she maintained a simple, pragmatic approach to her daily routine. She was the anchor of her family, a steady, warm presence who constantly balanced the relentless, sharp-edged ambition of her husband, Michael. Michael Warren was a man driven by the mechanics of leverage and profit. He operated a highly lucrative used car dealership named Bargain Motors, located miles away in West Palm Beach. It was a high-volume enterprise that generated massive amounts of liquid cash and served as the cornerstone of their expanding empire. Together, they had accumulated an impressive portfolio over their 18-year marriage. They controlled a fleet of vehicles, a collection of residential rental properties scattered across the county, and a private airplane parked just hundreds of feet from their back door. Yet, the financial architecture of their wealth was uniquely structured. The vast majority of these high-value assets, including the dealership, the real estate, and the properties, were legally held in Marlene's name. This detail was initially pitched as a savvy strategic move to protect the businesses from corporate liabilities. But as the years wore on and the affection drained from their union, that legal distinction evolved into an invisible, suffocating chain binding a deteriorating relationship. By early 1990, the financial ledger was thriving, but the emotional foundation of the Warren household was rapidly decaying. Marlene began to confide in her mother that she felt entirely trapped. The warmth of their early years had evaporated, replaced by cold indifference and sharp, sudden arguments over operational control and money. Michael spent increasingly long, unexplained hours at the West Palm Beach dealership, distancing himself from the estate in Wellington. He was a man heavily accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted, and he was acutely aware that his wife held the legal keys to everything he had spent nearly 2 decades building. Divorce seemed like the logical exit strategy, but the deep financial entanglement made a clean, bloodless break completely impossible. If they separated, Michael stood to lose the car lot, the rental properties, and his elevated social standing. He would be stripped of the very capital that defined his entire identity. The tension inside the Aero Club home grew thick and palpable. Marlene began to sense a distinct shift in her environment, a subtle, creeping dread that she could not easily dismiss. She began keeping closer track of the business ledgers. During hushed phone calls, she mentioned to close friends that if anything unnatural or violent ever happened to her, they needed to look very closely at her husband. She possessed no hard evidence of a physical threat, just the undeniable primal instinct of a woman who recognized that the man sitting across the dinner table now viewed her not as a life partner, but as a major financial obstacle. Bargain Motors occupied a blistering stretch of commercial real estate in West Palm Beach, defined by rows of polished sedans baking under the intense Florida sun and the constant, abrasive hustle of commissioned salesmen. It was an environment fueled by high-interest loans and desperate buyers. Michael Warren thrived in this ecosystem. He possessed the sharp, predatory instincts required to move inventory and secure financing for customers who lived paycheck to paycheck. But dealing in subprime auto loans inherently meant dealing with defaults. When payments abruptly stopped, Michael needed a reliable mechanism to retrieve his assets. He required someone willing to navigate poorly lit apartment complexes and hostile driveways in the dead of night to reclaim vehicles. Enter Sheila Keene. At 27 years old, Sheila possessed a hardened, abrasive edge that perfectly suited the automotive repossession industry. She was striking, with thick blonde hair and a commanding physical presence, but her appearance was secondary to her sheer operational ruthlessness. Working as a repo agent demanded a specific type of grit. She routinely arrived at default addresses at 3 in the morning, armed with duplicate keys and a quiet tow truck, sliding behind the wheel of a repossessed car before the owner even realized the engine had started. She was fearless, aggressive, and entirely unsentimental about the work. Michael recognized a mirrored reflection of his own ambition in her. They shared a blunt, transactional view of the world, a philosophy where morality was secondary to securing the asset. The professional boundary between the dealership owner and his top recovery agent collapsed with remarkable speed. Late-night vehicle repossessions seamlessly bled into late-night drinks at local dive bars, which eventually evolved into locked-door meetings inside Michael's executive office. The atmosphere on the asphalt lot began to shift. Employees at Bargain Motors were observant. They tracked the sudden, unexplained absences in the middle of the workday. They noticed the prolonged lunches and the undeniable heavy tension whenever the two shared a confined space. Sheila's status rapidly elevated from an independent contractor to an untouchable figure within the company hierarchy. She began dictating terms, acting less like hired muscle and more like a senior partner holding equity in the operation. Michael, usually a man of meticulous calculation, allowed his arrogance to override his caution. He began aggressively siphoning capital from the dealership's operational accounts to finance a shadow life. The financial drain was substantial. He signed a lease on an apartment for Sheila in a discreet residential complex miles away from his expansive equestrian estate in Wellington. He systematically covered her personal expenses, purchasing high-end clothing and paying her utility bills. He was essentially running a parallel household, funding his mistress using the liquid cash generated by an enterprise legally owned by his wife. Back in the 4,000-square-foot home in the Aero Club neighborhood, Marlene was actively reviewing the corporate ledgers. As the legal owner of the entire portfolio, the numbers were her domain. She possessed a sharp, analytical mind and quickly detected the bleeding revenue. The anomalies in the accounting were impossible to ignore. Missing cash bundles, fabricated expense reports, and withdrawals that possessed no corresponding invoices. Furthermore, the automotive community in Palm Beach County was insular. The whispers originating from the sales floor of Bargain Motors drifted across the county lines, eventually reaching Marlene's ears. The abstract sense of dread she had been harboring suddenly materialized into a concrete, devastating reality. It was not merely a physical betrayal, it was a sustained, aggressive financial theft. The ensuing confrontations inside the Wellington estate were visceral and uncompromising. Marlene cornered her husband, demanding accountability for the missing funds and the blonde repo agent living on his secret payroll. Michael responded with flat, aggressive dismissals. He attempted to dismantle her reality, loudly insisting she was paranoid and fundamentally misinterpreting standard business expenditures. He utilized his commanding physical presence to intimidate her into silence, but Marlene refused to break. Instead, she drew a hard, unforgiving line. During a particularly vicious argument, she explicitly leveraged the one vulnerability Michael possessed. She reminded him that her name rested on every single deed, every corporate license, and every bank account. She made it unequivocally clear that if he continued to humiliate her and drain their resources, she would legally dismantle the empire. She threatened to dissolve the marriage, seize the dealership, liquidate the rental properties, and leave him with absolutely nothing. That specific threat fundamentally altered the trajectory of their conflict. Michael found himself cornered by his own legal machinations. A divorce would be financially catastrophic, instantly reducing him from an affluent kingpin to a middle management employee stripped of his inventory. Sheila, too, had grown deeply accustomed to the continuous influx of cash and the elevated lifestyle. Returning to the grueling, dangerous existence of a street-level repo agent was no longer an option she was willing to entertain. By the spring of 1990, the loud, explosive arguments inside the Warren household ceased, replaced by a suffocating, lethal silence. Marlene confided in her parents that the situation had escalated beyond infidelity. She told them, with chilling clarity, that she genuinely believed her husband and his new associate were capable of profound violence. The tactical standoff had reached a breaking point. Michael was no longer calculating the cost of a divorce attorney. He was evaluating the precise, bloody mechanics of an assassination. Saturday, May the 26th, 1990, began with the heavy, suffocating humidity typical of South Florida. By mid-morning, the temperature was already pushing past 80 degrees Fahrenheit. It was Memorial Day weekend, a time usually reserved for neighborhood barbecues and the low drone of small private aircraft taxiing down the Aero Club runways. Inside the 4,000-square-foot estate, the central air conditioning hummed, sealing the occupants away from the oppressive heat. The residents projected an atmosphere of total, unshakable security. The master of the house was entirely absent. Michael had departed the property hours earlier, informing his family that he was driving south to a racetrack in the Miami area. The journey would place him roughly 70 miles away from Wellington. This was a highly convenient geographic buffer. He had specifically chosen a destination crowded with spectators, an environment where he would be highly visible to dozens of potential witnesses. The sprawling house was left to his wife and her 22-year-old son from a previous marriage, Joseph Aarons. In the expansive dining area, a late breakfast was underway. Joseph and a few of his friends sat around the table, casually discussing their plans for the long weekend. The matriarch of the house moved between the kitchen and the living spaces, navigating the morning with her usual grounded efficiency. The tension that normally choked the household was temporarily lifted by her husband's absence. The environment was domestic, relaxed, and utterly mundane. At approximately 10:45 a.m., the rhythmic crunch of tires against the long pavement of the driveway signaled an arrival. A white Chrysler LeBaron convertible, top raised, rolled onto the property. The vehicle moved at a steady, deliberate pace, completely ignoring the unspoken rule that strangers did not simply wander into the gated luxury of the Aero Club. The car came to a halt near the front entryway. The driver shifted into park, but left the engine idling. The heavy driver's side door swung open, and a figure stepped out onto the hot concrete. The intruder did not fit the aesthetic of the manicured equestrian community. It was a clown. The visual details were stark and jarring against the lush green landscaping. The figure wore a synthetic electric orange wig that sat unnaturally on the head. The face was entirely obscured by thick, opaque white grease paint, applied heavily to mask any recognizable human features. A large, bulbous red sponge nose was affixed to the center of the face. Below it, a grotesque red smile had been painted on, stretching aggressively past the natural lip line. The clown was dressed in a baggy, multicolored costume, concealing the physical build and gender of the person underneath. In one gloved hand, the painted intruder held a vibrant floral arrangement consisting of red and white carnations. In the other hand, a ribbon tethered 2 mylar foil balloons. One balloon featured an illustration of Snow White. The second was silver, stamped with an upbeat, generic phrase declaring the recipient to be the greatest. The clown closed the car door and began walking toward the main entrance. The stride was not the exaggerated, clumsy walk of a performer. It was measured, purposeful, lethal. Inside the dining room, the sound of the approaching footsteps was masked by the ambient noise of breakfast conversation. The clown reached the massive wooden double doors. There was no hesitation. A heavy, firm knock echoed through the foyer. The homeowner stepped away from the kitchen area, navigating the tiled floors toward the entryway. Joseph remained seated at the table, roughly 20 feet away. He had a clear, unobstructed line of sight down the hallway to the front door. He watched his mother reach for the brass handle. She pulled the heavy door inward. The dense, humid Florida air immediately rushed into the foyer, bringing with it the bizarre, brightly colored specter waiting on the threshold. The homeowner stood face to face with the intruder. There was no theatrical performance, no joyful greeting, no laughter. The clown remained entirely silent, standing rigid in the doorway. The only audible sound was the crinkling of the mylar balloons shifting in the warm morning breeze. A wave of confusion washed over the foyer. Assuming this was a quirky telegram delivery or a bizarre promotional stunt, she offered a polite observation. She looked down at the carnations and remarked on how pretty the flowers were. She lifted her hands, reaching out to accept the arrangement. The clown did not hand over the flowers. Instead, The figure smoothly raised its opposite hand. Concealed within the grip was a .38 caliber revolver. The barrel was leveled with cold precision directly at the homeowner's face. The transition from a confusing suburban interaction to absolute terminal violence took less than a fraction of a second. A single crack, deafening. The concussive blast shattered the quiet Saturday morning. The sharp smell of sulfur and burnt gunpowder instantly choked the enclosed hallway. The bullet struck with devastating accuracy, impacting the victim directly in the face. The physical force dropped her instantly. She collapsed backward onto the hard tile floor, her body going entirely limp. The foil balloon slipped from the killer's grasp, drifting upward to scrape quietly against the high ceiling. The bouquet of carnations tumbled to the floor, scattering bright red and white petals across the pooling blood. Inside the house, reality fractured. Joseph shoved the heavy breakfast table aside, the legs screeching against the floor, and sprinted toward the foyer. Outside, the shooter exhibited a chilling, psychopathic lack of urgency. The clown did not run. There was no frantic scramble to escape the scene of a broad daylight execution. The figure simply turned around and walked back to the idling Chrysler LeBaron with an unhurried, methodical stride. Joseph reached the entryway, his eyes briefly registering the catastrophic trauma inflicted on his mother before locking onto the retreating figure. He bolted out the front door. His bare feet slapped violently against the scorching pavement. He screamed at the driver, his voice tearing through the quiet neighborhood, demanding the vehicle stop. He closed the distance rapidly, getting within a few yards of the rear bumper. He immediately logged critical tactical details: the white paint, the tinted windows, and the distinct absence of a front license plate. The clown slid into the driver's seat and pulled the door shut. The engine flared. With the same mechanical calmness exhibited on the porch, the killer shifted the transmission into gear. The tires gripped the asphalt, and the LeBaron accelerated smoothly down the street. It did not peel out. It did not fishtail. It simply drove away, merging into the labyrinth of Wellington's exclusive avenues, disappearing like a ghost in broad daylight. Joseph turned and rushed back into the house. The scene in the foyer was a waking nightmare. His mother lay motionless on the tiles, bleeding heavily and gasping for air. He grabbed the phone. The emergency dispatcher on the other end of the 911 call was met with the raw, unfiltered terror of a son frantically begging for an ambulance, trying to articulate the impossible reality that a clown had just arrived at their home and pulled a trigger. Paramedics arrived within minutes, their sirens cutting through the affluent silence of the Aero Club. They breached the front doors, forced to step over the discarded carnations and the brightly colored costume props to reach the victim. The medical personnel worked frantically to stabilize her compromised airway. She was loaded into the back of an ambulance and rushed to a local trauma center. She was placed on advanced life support, her body fighting a desperate, losing battle against severe, irreversible neurological damage. 2 days later, the medical machinery was unhooked. The execution was officially complete. The immediate aftermath of the shooting triggered a surreal tactical response. Dispatchers broadcasted a county-wide BOLO, "Be on the lookout." Law enforcement officers stationed along the major arteries of Palm Beach County were suddenly tasked with hunting down a suspect matching an impossible description. They scanned passing traffic for an electric orange wig, a red sponge nose, and a painted smile. The sheer absurdity of the profile hindered the initial dragnet. A clown driving a white Chrysler LeBaron convertible down the Florida Turnpike should have been a blindingly obvious target. Yet, the vehicle had vanished. The driver had seamlessly melted into the heavy Memorial Day weekend traffic, exploiting the holiday congestion and the maze of suburban roads branching off the main highways. Within hours, the psychological fallout hit Wellington like a physical shockwave. The Aero Club was a fortress of privilege, a place where violent crime was an abstract concept meant for the evening news, not the manicured driveways of multi-million-dollar estates. When word spread that a resident had been executed on her own doorstep by an assassin disguised as a joyful messenger, the illusion of safety collapsed. Panic infected the affluent grid. Security protocols were overhauled overnight. Iron gates were deadbolted. Homeowners refused to open their doors for unexpected couriers. Delivery drivers bearing floral arrangements or standard mail were met with intense suspicion. often greeted by residents holding firearms behind frosted glass. The universal symbol of childhood amusement had been effectively weaponized, leaving a toxic dread over the entire community. The innocence of a suburban weekend was replaced by a paranoid lockdown. Detectives from the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office immediately initiated a multi-tiered search. The physical evidence left at the threshold, the tethered mylar balloons and the scattered red and white carnations, provided the first tangible breadcrumbs. Investigators needed to reverse engineer the assassin's logistics. A killer meticulously dressed in full theatrical garb did not just materialize out of thin air. Every item was a commercial product. The props had to be acquired locally. The search grid for the getaway vehicle yielded the first major break exactly 4 days later. A patrol unit located the white Chrysler LeBaron abandoned in a crowded parking lot at a strip mall in Royal Palm Beach, just a few miles from the crime scene. The car had been reported stolen from a local rental agency a month prior. The tactical recovery team processed the vehicle with surgical precision. The exterior was wiped completely clean of usable prints, demonstrating the perpetrator's forensic awareness. But the interior held critical microscopic clues. Vacuuming the upholstery and the driver's side floorboards revealed distinct synthetic orange fibers, a direct, undeniable match to the neon wig described by the victim's son. Furthermore, crime scene technicians extracted a few strands of long, brown human hair resting on the seats. The car was the definitive link, proving the assassin had used a stolen rental as a disposable burner vehicle to navigate the affluent neighborhood undetected. Simultaneously, a massive canvassing operation targeted every party supply store, florist, and costume shop within a 50-mile radius. Detectives flashed photographs of the distinct foil balloons. The breakthrough occurred at a public supermarket in West Palm Beach. Employees distinctly recalled a woman purchasing those exact items less than 2 hours before the execution. The clerks described the buyer as a striking female with long brown hair. They noted her demeanor as intensely focused, impatient. She had paid entirely in cash. The floral arrangement was subsequently tracked to a nearby commercial florist. The shop owner confirmed a recent cash transaction for a specific bouquet of red and white carnations. The physical description of the buyer aligned perfectly with the report generated from the supermarket. A tall, commanding woman with brown hair who moved with a rigid sense of urgency. The net tightened even further when investigators zeroed in on the theatrical components. A specialty costume shop situated within the county limits provided the most damning logistical evidence. 2 days prior to the shooting, a woman matching the exact same physical profile had walked through the front doors. She marched to the counter and requested a highly specific inventory: a clown suit, a bright orange wig, and a complete theatrical grease paint kit. The clerk recalled the transaction vividly. The customer had insisted on paying with a large wad of cash, and she seemed entirely uninterested in the fit or the style of the costume. She was strictly focused on acquiring the visual disguise as quickly as possible. The paper trail was practically non-existent, deliberately severed by the exclusive use of cash. However, the consistent eyewitness accounts formed a rigid, undeniable profile. The assassin was not a random, chaotic drifter. It was a highly orchestrated, premeditated hit. The killer had spent days systematically gathering the necessary components, building a psychological Trojan horse that would ensure the target opened her heavy front door without a shred of hesitation. Detectives began cross-referencing the physical description of the meticulous buyer with the victim's immediate circle. They were hunting for a tall woman with brown hair, someone with unrestricted access to large reserves of cash, and someone possessing the cold, calculated nerve to walk up to a porch in broad daylight and pull a trigger. The investigative focus rapidly shifted away from the perimeter of Wellington. The authorities turned their attention sharply toward the West Palm Beach car lot, the unaccounted corporate funds, and the aggressive repossession agent who had firmly embedded herself into the widower's shadow life. The frantic hunt for a painted clown seamlessly transitioned into the hunt for a woman who spent her nights stealing back defaulted cars. Detectives converged on the widower with absolute tactical focus. He was brought into the interrogation room, projecting the somber, quiet aura of a grieving husband, but the performance rang hollow to seasoned investigators. When pressed on his exact coordinates during the execution, he immediately deployed a watertight, heavily documented alibi. He provided toll booth receipts, gas station timestamps, and multiple eyewitness accounts, placing him at a busy Miami racetrack. He was undeniably 70 miles south of the Aero Club estate when the bullet was fired. He had insulated himself with unshakable geographic distance. The authorities knew he had not pulled the trigger. He was the architect, not the mechanic. The crosshairs snapped directly onto the aggressive repossession agent. She was pulled into the precinct and seated across from homicide detectives. She projected a hardened, abrasive defiance, completely immune to standard interrogation pressures. She issued flat, monotone denials to every inquiry. She claimed she spent the entire Saturday morning executing routine vehicle repossessions. When confronted with the eyewitness descriptions from the supermarket and the costume shop, her expression remained entirely blank. A search warrant was swiftly executed at her apartment. The clandestine residence, heavily funded by the West Palm Beach dealership, investigators dismantled the interior, hunting for the .38 caliber revolver, the grease paint, or the baggy clown suit. The physical sweep yielded absolutely nothing of substance. The assassin had meticulously sanitized her environment. The absence of a smoking gun forced the investigation into a chaotic lateral drift. The defense strategy deliberately muddied the waters, forcing the police to examine the massive list of enemies the used car magnate had cultivated. Bargain Motors was a breeding ground for raw hostility. Detectives were obligated to interview dozens of furious, financially ruined individuals whose vehicles had been snatched in the dead of night. Could a disgruntled, heavily indebted customer have disguised themselves to exact maximum psychological and physical revenge on the family? Investigators burned hundreds of man-hours chasing these phantom leads down blind alleys. They pulled repossession logs, cross-referencing angry buyers with violent criminal records. Every lead systematically fizzled out. The hostile customers possessed obvious motives, but absolutely none of them held the synchronized insider knowledge of the household's weekend schedule, nor the financial backing to orchestrate a clean, untraceable hit. These red herrings drained crucial momentum from the primary suspect. The core of the investigative paralysis lay in the era itself. The crime scene technicians possessed the physical strands of brown hair and the synthetic orange wig fibers extracted from the abandoned Chrysler LeBaron. In a modern context, that biological material would secure an indictment within weeks. But forensic science at the dawn of the 1990s was agonizingly primitive. DNA profiling was in its absolute infancy, restricted to massive, pristine biological samples that simply did not exist in this case. The laboratory could only perform subjective, microscopic hair comparisons. An analyst could state the strands were visually consistent with the suspect's hair, but it lacked the rigid statistical certainty required for a capital murder trial. Without a taped confession, the murder weapon, or undeniable biological proof, the circumstantial timeline of costume purchases and an ongoing illicit affair was deemed to be legally insufficient. The state attorney's office reviewed the dense binders of evidence and refused to file charges. The threshold for reasonable doubt was simply too high. The momentum died. The investigation hit a solid concrete wall. The case file was shoved into a steel cabinet in the records division, relegated to the cold case archives. Years dissolved into decades. The physical evidence, the hairs, the neon fibers, the ribbon from the Mylar balloons, sat frozen in a climate-controlled vault. Meanwhile, the primary targets seamlessly integrated their lives. Michael formally severed his remaining legal ties to his deceased wife's estate, absorbing the liquidated assets. 12 years after the execution, he and his former repo agent legally married. They abandoned the heavy humidity of Palm Beach County, relocating to the quiet, mountainous terrain of Abingdon, Virginia. They purchased a sprawling, expensive home and opened a popular, family-friendly burger restaurant. They lived a highly comfortable, upper-middle-class existence. They attended community events and managed a thriving business, functioning exactly like ordinary, successful entrepreneurs. They operated under the assumption that the bloody morning in Florida had been permanently erased from history. 24 years passed in absolute silence. Then, the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit systematically pulled the dusty files back onto an active desk. Technology had finally evolved to catch up with the preserved evidence. The microscopic strands retrieved from the driver's seat of the stolen getaway car were submitted to an advanced forensic laboratory. Mitochondrial analysis and short tandem repeat profiling, methodologies that sounded like pure science fiction in 1990, were aggressively applied to the degraded biological samples. The laboratory technicians successfully extracted a viable, complete genetic sequence. They compared it against a known sample. The results returned with mathematical, absolute certainty. The biological material abandoned inside the Chrysler LeBaron belonged exclusively to Sheila. The logistical puzzle from the Memorial Day weekend was finally locked into place by incontrovertible, microscopic science. The 27-year waiting game was over. The ghost in the orange wig finally had a verifiable name. In September 2017, a heavily armed tactical team surrounded a quiet, upscale residence in Abingdon, Virginia. The 54-year-old restaurant owner was placed in handcuffs, finally confronted with the ghosts of Palm Beach County. She was extradited back to Florida to face first-degree murder charges, but the wheels of justice ground at an agonizing pace. Pre-trial motions, fierce defense maneuvers attacking the decades-old forensic methodologies, and a global pandemic delayed the proceedings for another 6 years. The prosecution possessed the DNA, but key witnesses had died, and memories had severely faded. Facing a grueling trial and the very real possibility of a compromised jury, the state offered a compromise. In April 2023, 33 years after the execution, a plea deal was struck. The former repo agent pleaded guilty to second-degree murder while simultaneously maintaining her innocence. It was a legal paradox designed strictly to secure a reduced sentence. The judge handed down a 12-year term. However, after calculating the time already served awaiting trial and applying standard statutory credits, she walked out of a Florida prison mere months later. It was a deeply flawed, hollow conclusion to an orchestrated assassination. A universal symbol of joy, weaponized into a vessel of terror. Marlene Warren expected a simple gesture of kindness, only to face a cold execution masked in bright grease paint. The justice system finally named her killer, yet the brevity of the sentence feels like a grotesque punchline. 33 years of stolen life, traded for mere months behind bars. The synthetic orange wig now degrades in an evidence vault, but the psychological scar left on that Florida community is permanent. They learned a brutal truth. The most ruthless predators do not lurk in the shadows. They walk right up to your front porch, hiding behind a painted smile. Please like this video and share your thoughts about this case in the comments. Be sure to check out our previous videos as well. See you soon.